We're talking Naruto's top 15 worst plot holes.
Naruto, very overrated. The storyline kind of fell off at the end. The spoilers, Naruto kind of being like a god. Everything was decided by fate, whereas the whole time in the story of Naruto, it's about how fate doesn't matter and you can work your way up to become Hokage. But it turns out fate is what kind of helped him. It's not as good as One Piece.
He was born to a Hokage, reincarnated from a Hokage, who was reincarnated from the pillar of all ninja history, was born with bloodline abilities and gifts, inherited a god that grants him multiplicative powers on top of his own. That's Naruto. He was gifted with all this shit, but he's also lazy, stupid, and untalented according to everyone he meets. He should have died hundreds of times over the course of the series due to his own negligence, foolishness, and lack of preparedness, but was bailed out every time undeservedly.
Naruto is nothing but retcons, plot holes, and underdevelopment.
Naruto's biggest weakness is not respect for elders or time-honored values, but rather it is its astonishingly anachronistic gender roles. Its representation suggests that men are men and women are women, and that they differ naturally in regard to aptitude and vocation. I need to say that when it comes to romance, it's so abundantly clear that Naruto and Sasuke would have made much better romantic partners than anyone.
Likewise, if you set up one character as a villain, but later decide you want them to have been a secret good guy all along, it makes it awkward that you expect an audience to just ignore that your supposed secret good guy murdered several unarmed children. Though, what do I know, it seems like most of the fandom does. The most powerful shinobi include a wheelchair user, an amputee, a little person, and an obese man. Compared to several mainstream manga, Naruto's diversity is actually pretty great. However, Kishimoto does lack a little when it comes to gender representation.
Neji is 100% spot on. Just get fucking wrecked, Naruto. Good God, your asshole is blossoming open right now. Get fucked, bitch. You little orange dumbass.
The first part of this video focuses on providing a broader analysis of Naruto, throughout which I'll compare it to other shonen manga to highlight its strengths. Its second part is a comprehensive, in-depth analysis of the story that will serve as the greatest argument for its outstanding quality. It offers you a complex understanding of the manga that I can guarantee will surprise even older fans. The third part will feature refutations of popular criticisms, which hadn't yet been addressed in the video. There are timestamps for each chapter, so if you want to watch a refutation of a particular argument, you can easily find it. If you have been led to think Naruto is bad or mediocre, and not worth your time, this is your warning to check for yourself. What I will say is that Naruto is by far the best shonen manga, and making this fact clear is what this video was created for. And to conclude this brief introduction, know that if you can't handle criticism for manga you enjoy, this video is not for you. I will not shy away from discussing flaws of Reddit's favorite manga no one dares to criticize, like Hunter x Hunter, Fullmetal Alchemist, and One Piece. As most of you may know, Naruto has become quite infamous over the years. Most say that Naruto is a mediocre or even weak work, that it is riddled with plot holes, that its character development is lacking, that the ending is poorly written, that its second part is substantially worse than the first, and so on. This consensus around Naruto is misguided on all these points. Naruto is the most cohesive, thematically solid, and profound story in its demographic. It is severely misjudged due primarily to the lack of media literacy and critical thinking skills from those who disparage it. It's undeniably a trend to hate on Naruto, and even fans of the manga simply accept popular viewpoints without questioning their legitimacy. It's extremely rare for a long-running shonen manga to introduce ambitious themes and plot points that unfold throughout the story, and are concluded in a satisfying way, to present three-dimensional characters who develop cohesively over the course of the plot, and are ideologically challenged at each major arc, to be rich and dense in symbolism, to write archetypal characters masterfully, and to have a well-built fictional world, and character designs that fit perfectly that world. Naruto excels in all these aspects at once, in a way that no other shonen does. Shonen manga are limited by several factors, such as their often volatile length due to bureaucracy, their weekly release schedule, the grueling work ethic that sustains the industry, etc. Yet Naruto manages to transcend its medium. I'll start by talking about its art, a fundamental aspect of any manga. Kishimoto's artistic skills are absurdly underrated, The art of Naruto, in my opinion, has not been matched by any other weekly manga. Kishimoto's character designs feature a unique and cohesive aesthetic that could very well be considered the most iconic of any work from Shonen Jump. In fact, it may as well be among the most iconic of all fictional works. And his sense of perspective, anatomy, and human expression are unparalleled. Even those who dislike the series admit its character designs are top-notch. I will later discuss each relevant character in depth and explain how their designs carry meaning and adds to them additional nuance. Indeed, Naruto's aesthetic is beyond legendary. The shinobi seals which the characters perform to conjure their jutsu, the ocular patterns that some specialized have, the shinobi tools, like the kunai and the shuriken, the demon kaiju and the animal summons, the mech-like Susanoo, the dark, surreal visuals of genjutsu, the shinobi uniforms and headbands, Akatsuki's uniforms, the crests of shinobi clans, the cloning jutsu, the striking design of each village. All of these elements are part of one single fantasy world, and somehow, everything fits brilliantly together. It's almost absurd to compare Naruto's visual identity to, say, that of Hunter x Hunter, which is so inconsistent that if you were to analyze its character roster, with no knowledge of what you're looking at, you'd think some are designed for a shonen manga, others by furry accounts on Twitter, and you wouldn't be able to tell protagonist characters from gag characters, or major antagonists and relevant secondary characters from random background ones. Some characters have soberly proportioned faces, others look like grotesque, cartoonish caricatures. Now back to the broader topic of Naruto's art. Kishimoto is a master of composition. Naruto contains some of the most dramatic panels of any manga, a feat even more impressive when you consider that it was a weekly release. Indeed, Naruto's highly artistic, deliberate, astounding paneling is only matched by those of legendary innovators such as Akira Toriyama's and Osamu Tezuka's. He is also highly skilled at drawing movement and violence, which makes the frequent fight scenes clean and intuitive. The use of lines of varying thicknesses to create artistic effects generates impactful images. The level of discipline, creativity, and dexterity that this type of technique requires is immense. At times you see the use of brushes to convey a mythological figure, in a way that evokes artistic Japanese tradition. The way Kishimoto draws water, and other elements, is worthy of note too. It's astoundingly meticulous. Kishimoto is so great at drawing faces, you can identify every character just by his, even taking away his hair, and so on, despite them being substantially more realistically proportioned than those of your average shonen. Compare is to say, JoJo, in which even female characters have similar faces to most male characters, or to One Piece, in which every girl looks like a clone of Nami. And to conclude this brief analysis of Naruto's visuals, Kishimoto's mastery in conveying emotion must also be highlighted. The elegance and respect with which he draws his characters is truly special and grants a whole additional layer of maturity to the work. Adjacent to the topic of visuals is Naruto's world building, which I shortly spoke about before. Though not overly complex, Naruto's politics are much more interesting and deeper, more mature, than those of the vast majority of shonen, even outside of manga in fantastical literature. Most arcs happen because of conspiracies that involve politics. Pain only created Akatsuki because the reign was constantly made to be a battlefield for larger nations, due to its small size and geographical location, and lack of de facto sovereignty. Zabuza only fought Team 7 because he wanted to overthrow the corrupt government of the Mist, as in order to found a coup, he has to work for the Mafia. Antagonists like Orochimaru and Sasori became evil, in large part, because of the losses they suffered from wars between nations, and several others are deeply impacted by such wars, and in nuanced ways. The foundation of the leaf is covered in full, and the complex relationship of its two major clans is what caused Madara to defect, and he was partially justified in doing so. The Uchiha massacre, the driving force behind Sasuke's journey in the story, was only done to avoid a coup. Konoha Crush was a layered conspiracy in which the Sen collaborated with Orochimaru to destroy the leaf. But, in reality, Orochimaru had killed the Kazekage and impersonated him to advance his scheme. The Sen had been facing issues with its army, and they felt threatened by other villages, by the leaf especially, which is in part why Baki fell for Orochimaru's ploy, and so on. The Sand as a whole is a nice microcosmic example of Naruto's world building. There are many interesting details, such as the uniforms of its soldiers, which were designed to camouflage them against the sand, and the fact that its buildings are made of clay and stucco, to keep their inside cool. Or the techniques exclusive to the sand, the puppet jutsu, which were created to account for their lesser numbers, to avoid shinobi casualties. When Hashirama summons the other Kage to sell to them the tailed beasts, to create a power balance in a diplomatic effort for universal peace, the Kazekage rejects the offer, asking instead for a quarter of the Land of Fire's territory, for theirs is a desert, with little arable land, as well as 30% of what the other villages would pay for a biju in compensation. Naruto is filled with details like these, which makes its world feel alive and grounded. Incredibly designed. Just to add one more, the naming scheme of the shinobi villages. Konohagakure means village hidden in the leaves, because it was built within a forest and below a mountain to conceal it. Tsunagakure means village hidden in the sand, because it is hidden within a desert, and also covered by a mountain range, and so on. It's such a charming aspect of Naruto's world. Contrast Naruto's world building and politics with those of One Piece, which have more holes than Swiss cheese. Its world is deep as a puddle. The leaders of most nations are as profound as a caricature. There's one literally named Burger, who's designed after Uncle Sam. There are basically no geopolitics to speak of. The world has no structure beyond the surface. At no point in the story is, say, the issue of Yonko territories addressed with any depth, nor are conflicts between nations present within the story. Even when they could be, they are merely alluded to, and don't actually exist. Think of Elbaf's aggression, a defining factor of their history. What are its consequences besides people vaguely fearing giants? Did they hold any territories, or did they simply pillage other nations? And what did that entail? Which nations did it affect? All that matters is we're told they were aggressive. Though the network of the Celestial Dragons, with the Holy Knights and the Gorosei, and the secret and supreme rule of Himu, who tricks the world into believing it is free and democratic, is interesting, and rather based, their writing is terrible. So, why didn't they take Luffy's existence seriously, even after learning he has the mythical god Nika fruit? There's no reasonable excuse for this. No cope that really justifies this blatant failure in writing. The only correct answer is that One Piece is riddled with retcons that were not properly integrated into the story, and Luffy's fruit was only made into the god fruit of the legendary rival of the secret villain, after hundreds and hundreds of chapters had been written, and the Holy Knights were a last-minute addition as well, which is also why they didn't stop Fisher Tiger's invasion of Marijois. While on that note, Himu is written as such a stupid and useless antagonist when the plot needs him to be. He allowed Sabo to spot him in his throne, and couldn't even stop him from escaping, even with the help of the Gorosei. That shows a Saturday morning cartoon villain level of incompetence. Oda will constantly make up implausible scenarios, and turn major characters into idiots, so he can justify absurd retcons and other writing decisions, completely ruining the cohesion of One Piece's world and its characters. The Wano arc is full of examples of this phenomenon. Think of Oden dancing like a moron for years to justify the timeline, and his blind trust in Orochi, which was needed to avoid him making a proper plan to free his land, and possibly call the Whitebeard pirates for help, or the Big Mom pirates virtually sleeping on banana peels as soon as storm Onigashima. Naruto's most important fights take place at symbolic locations. Team 7's last fight with Zabuza happens at the later named Naruto Bridge. The two major fights of Sasuke against Naruto take place at the Valley of the End, and in the second one, the statues of Hashirama and Madara are destroyed, signifying the end of the eternal conflict of brother against brother. Sasuke's fight against Itachi happens at the Uchiha hideout, and in the end, it was fully destroyed, adding a new layer of meaning to that sequence. Inversely, Naruto fought Pain as the crater where the leaf used to stand before it had been destroyed by the antagonists. Kakashi fought Obito in his shadow dimension, which is emblematic of their loneliness, of their inner void, and so on. Kishimoto's immense prowess as a writer is constantly overlooked. It's surprising to me how the discourse surrounding the characters of Naruto often focuses on trivial matters, such as the fact that the 12th or 15th secondary character, who, by the way, probably had one or more fully developed fight scenes, or even their own character arc, wasn't at the center of a major arc again, didn't end up with the husband or wife some fanfic reader wanted, or something like that. To me, such complaints only reveal the strength of Naruto's characters. Each one of them is so unique, so interesting, and visually captivating, that fans became overly attached to them, even though it was clear from the start, many of them wouldn't be as relevant to the story in the medium or long term. If we applied similar criticisms to other shonen manga, many of them would seem pathetic in comparison to Naruto, and practically none would stand out positively. Think of One Piece, whose main cast had their character growth effectively reversed since the start of the timeskip. They have been flanderized to such an extent that they seem like parodies of their former selves. For instance, Sanji was once a gentleman, whose excessive admiration for women often turned him into a fool. In modern language, he was a simp. He couldn't help himself. But over time, he became more and more perverted. In the Thriller Bark arc, an antagonist character who's got the invisibility devil fruit sneaks into Nami's shower and harasses her. He then kidnaps her and forces her to become his bride. Sanji comes to rescue Nami and proudly proclaims he's mad as the antagonist, not because he humiliated and degraded Nami, but because he's the one who should have eaten the invisibility fruit, so he could do the same to beautiful woman. From that point onwards, his character had been ruined, and his storyline in Hokage served only to retcon the charm out of his original backstory, since the actual development he could have underwent and the interesting relationship he'd achieved were literally erased from his memory once the arc was concluded. I could do a similar breakdown of the negative development of most One Piece's main characters, and many secondary ones would fare even worse, such as Smoker and Tashigi. Naruto's combat, her magic system, is incredibly solid. It's polished and neither confusing or counterintuitive, nor simplistic, and it is utilized in such a way that enhances the highly strategic fights of the manga, increasing their tension and enabling characters to outsmart their enemies, and showcase a huge variety of abilities that are simultaneously limitless in their scope of design and grounded in the world that was established. And its mechanics are also taken into account by the world building. It is fully centered around Chakra, its uses, and its users. There are many impressive and thoughtful details, such as geopolitics, that are, for example, written around the tailed beasts, which are effectively akin to nuclear weapons, conspiracies that revolve around eyes capable of performing ocular jutsu, as well as charming logistical considerations, such as the presence of summonable Shinobi animal messengers. There are so many details that make Chakra feel truly belonging to Naruto's world. As yet another example, there's the Uchiha Tablet, a mysterious stone containing a code decipherable only by Sharingan users. And the more one develops his Sharingan, the more of it he can understand. And the seemingly minor detail plays a massive role in the narrative. First I'll compare Chakra to Fullmetal Alchemist's combat system, which is based on dynamic alchemy. It can be said to be overly simplistic. There are barely any rules and limitations that ground it, and it doesn't have much impact on fights. Many characters don't feel as though they have a truly unique set of skills that could force their opponents to thoughtfully strategize against them. Most alchemists just use their powers to make pillars, spikes, or walls out of the ground. Edward often uses it to make weapons. Most abilities are generic, not creatively designed, and, or, aren't used very creatively. As such, some fights rely entirely on other factors to be interesting or meaningful. In contrast to alchemy, Chakra allows each character to express himself in ways that are often unique and reflects their personalities in more profound and deliberate ways. It also has more limitations than simply forcing characters to perform a particular motion, to conjure their abilities, or having characters only be able to specialize in one or two types of magic. For instance, characters have a limited amount of Chakra to spend on each fight, and some abilities can only be used once or twice in certain contexts, such as the Chidori in Part 1, or the Rasen Shuriken during Part 2's first half, and or their user must meet specific requirements to cast them, such as Sasuke's Kirin, which required him to charge the clouds, so he wouldn't have to artificially generate the huge amount of electricity needed for the technique, but merely control that which the environment had been stirred to produce. And as such, that ability was also limited to one use, effectively. Alchemy does require the environments to be used effectively to an extent, but that rarely comes into play. A great example of a fight that was hugely disappointing, with one of the major factors for it having been so underwhelming being Full Metal Alchemist's magic system, is the very last one. Father, a near godlike being, who'd just realized his master plan of sacrificing countless lives to fuel his power, just stands still and allows every single character imaginable to strike him, while he conjures barriers for protection, and none of the attacks feel even slightly impactful. It's almost comical, and reminded me of a nostalgia critic skit, out of that one Avengers scene. Father does basically nothing during the entire ordeal. He unleashes a blast of energy once, and nobody gets hurt by it. And later, he attacks with fire, but a basic wall is enough to block it. Then, he finally does something meaningful. He kills Greed with a simple counterattack, though Ling Yao remained alive. That pitiful performance was enough to drain him of the energy he'd amassed during 400 years. Edward finishes him off with the same alchemical-based attacks he's been using since the start of the series, showcasing little growth, and a barehanded punch. Of course, the thematic meaning is that the prideful false god was bested by a teenager. Similar thematic beats are present for many other fights against final antagonists in fiction, Naruto's included. Though, in Naruto's case, Team 7 and Obito defeated Kaguya with intricate strategies, and she's very menacing throughout the fight, displaying a variety of deadly techniques that demands the protagonist's characters to adapt and think of ways to counterattack. In FMA's case, however, there are no clever tactics through which the underdog, the puny humans, used to overcome their great foe, not even much tension in this so important final fight, and the main villain ended up seeming pathetically weak, and not just prideful, but also incredibly stupid and incompetent, contradicting his previous characterization. Consequently, the victory of the protagonists didn't feel earned at all. Now, I'll go the other way around and compare Chakra to Nen, Hunter x Hunter's combat system. Yes, the latter may seem more complex at first, but when we explore their utilization in the story, it becomes clear that in reality it is not. The two systems are remarkably similar. Each has a set of natures, and characters tend to only be able to specialize in one or two simultaneously. Each nature can be countered by another, and both forms of energy are finite, with depletion incapacitating the user. The main difference between them is that half of Nen's categories are much more specific than those of Naruto, and some abilities are rather complex and require specific conditions to be met in order to be used, which also holds true for some features in Naruto. In practice, the whole Nen system justifies unique and bizarre abilities, but those that lead to greater fights than those of Naruto, those that lead to greater strategies than those of Naruto's fights. Are said abilities implemented well in the story, better than those of Naruto? Is Nen better executed than Chakra? The answer is a resounding no, and this is most expressed in the fights with Gon. The Nen ability of the very protagonist of Hunter x Hunter is, basically, just a supercharged punch, as well as a basic Nen slash and a basic Nen projectile, which he sparingly uses. The strategies he employs on his fights are either simple, or they rely on other factors. Compare it to Naruto's jutsu arsenal. He's got the Shadow Clone Jutsu, the Transformation Jutsu, and the Rasengan, and he later learns other techniques, such as the Rasen Shuriken, all of which are used creatively throughout the series, alongside other factors as well, such as ninja tools, summons, and transformations. On average, Nen abilities are not more unique, or complex than Kekkei Genkai, or other non-generic Naruto abilities. Some abilities of Hunter x Hunter come with, or are empowered by fashion bargains. They require something in trade for their full power to be unleashed. The exact same thing is true for many present in Naruto. In fact, fashion bargains are at the core of Naruto's plot. For example, Gon's transformation in the Chimera Ant arc, which resulted from an Nen pact. Gon got so mad at Pito for killing his friend, he trades his future as an Nen user, for a power boost so absurd he'd be able to kill her. Kite's death is also rather devoid of weight, since Gon had literally seen him once in his life, as he had only appeared once in the manga before the arc, and in the anime, even that short moment was not adapted. Gon's reaction to Kite's death feels forced in both versions, incredibly so in the anime. Later it's revealed Kite isn't even dead, that he was reborn in a Chimera Ant's body, and that there was a never before mentioned sibling of Killua, who's possessed by an incredibly powerful entity that can do basically anything through magic, and she just happens to love Killua so much that she'll realize his wish to heal Gon like a genie, one of the most blatant and least foreshadows Deus Ex Machina I have ever seen. In Naruto, the eyes of the Uchiha are cursed. They essentially grant power to their users in proportion to their suffering. Sasuke is told by his brother he must kill his best friend in order to evolve his Sharingan into a Mangekyo. Sasuke refuses, and as a consequence, hundreds of chapters later, when he duels Itachi, he still doesn't have it, and to compensate for his lacking power, he has to leave his village to work with Orochimaru, cursing himself through a ritual which literally killed him, so he could strengthen his demonic transformation, and most importantly, risking becoming possessed and losing everything for a chance of beating his brother, his own way. He'd only unlocked the Mangekyo after killing Itachi, and learning that, in reality, he had been forced to kill their family by the Leaf's deep state, live a life of exile, and die alongside that secret. And that he's only alive because Itachi cared so dearly for him that he went against his superiors to include his survival in his plan, which consisted of being killed by his very hand in the end. What this example entails is that characters in Naruto may be presented with fashion bargains which have real, lingering consequences in the plot, if they accept them, like Naruto with the Kyuubi, and if they reject them, like Sasuke with the Mangekyo. Now for another example on Hunter x Hunter's side. Both Kurapika and Sasuke are avengers on behalf of their massacred clans. Yet, in one instance, the perpetrator of the massacre is personally connected to the deuteragonist, and in the other, it's an organization with seemingly no connection to the victim at all. And even after 400 chapters, the motivation for the massacre is still left unclear, making the entire plot thread not feel as weighty. Kurapika's drive for revenge still dictates his course of action, of course, and he, like Sasuke, hunts down the people responsible for the demise of his clan. But they too are very powerful and won't lose easily. So how does Kurapika deal with that? How does he grow his power? Well, he makes a vow that forces his strongest power to only be used against the people he wishes to kill. Alright, so how is that explored throughout the series? It isn't. He never loses anything because of that limitation. And even besides that, his special eyes are so incredibly powerful from the get-go that he can toy with Uvogin, one of the strongest characters we'd seen by that point, and humiliate him, killing him instantly when he's done. In that fight, Kurapika is almost written like a Mary Sue, like a fanfiction character. Uvogin was shown to be so tough, nothing could seemingly hurt him. He's so absurdly strong, he can kill a man with a scream, and split a tiny fragment of a skull with greater force than a rifle can shoot a bullet. Yet Kurapika can simply block a punch from him and mock him for it. A big bang punch at that, meaning all of his aura is concentrated on his fist, leaving the rest of his body exposed, a proper, named attack. Even when Uvogin strikes his arm with a fully powered punch, the damage is fully healed immediately after, because when he's using his eyes, he can just use every Nen branch as if he were innately proficient in them, and that means he can heal any wound instantly, and at no cost. Just as a reminder, this is the first, and only time we see Kurapika fight to this date, and he'd practiced Nen for a mere 6 months. That, and a vow, that's dictated he can only use his full power against the only people he wants to fight, were enough for a teenager to beat one of the strongest Nen users we knew at the time. Uvogin did not even remember he'd killed Kurapika's clan at first, and no new information is learned from their fight. Kurapika's bluff was very smart, but his strategy in the fight didn't make perfect sense. Why couldn't Uvogin feel the chains wrapping around him, even if they were invisible? Neither character has to deal with any limitation, and the emotional impact of such a major, climactic fight was about as weak as it could have been. Even Kurapika seems as though he's mildly inconvenienced throughout it, and after, as he walks away like a badass. I can already predict some redditors will claim Uvogin would have won if he hadn't underestimated Kurapika. But that's not what was implied in the slightest. Kurapika dominated Uvogin and went into the fight, saying to his face, nonchalantly, that he would kill him easily. He wasn't even a little concerned. He even explained how his powers worked to Uvogin as a courtesy, something no smart character who expects even a mild threat would do. I know someone will say, but Kurapika's other ability, Emperor Time, takes time of his life. Yes, I know, its cost is 1 hour for each second of use, but that's a negligent cost. Even if Kurapika fought against someone for a whole hour with Emperor Time on, he would only spend less than a year of his life, and that cost will likely never matter anyway, and has not mattered in over 400 chapters. Does anyone really believe Kurapika will die of old age? I don't think so. The examples I've mentioned are emblematic of the macrocosm of their respective stories. The fights of Hunter x Hunter are, for the most part, lacking in emotional weight, stakes, and even the aspect which fans praise the most, their strategies, are not in any way more complex than those of Naruto. Indeed, they are simpler on average, though this statement does not seem to apply to the ongoing succession arc, in which many characters essentially acquire JoJo stands. And as a final example for this comparison, I'll talk about how each series presents their combat system and powers. There's Hidan from Naruto, whose ability is more complex than nearly every Nen ability, showcased in the Hunter x Hunter anime. Yet, Kishimoto doesn't feel the need to treat the viewer like an idiot by over-explaining Hidan's powers, either through an omniscient narrator, or through a character exposing it, verbally, in a clunky way, which often happens in Hunter x Hunter. Morel takes 4 whole pages to explain his. Knuckle too over-explains it to such a degree that it makes his seem more confusing than it actually is, when it would be way more interesting if his opponents had to uncover its machinations for themselves. If Gon has to hone his detective skills, an integral skill of any competent hunter, as part of his training, Hisoka infamously explains more than a couple times his bungee gun. Of course, I could go on. Hidan's jutsu comes with a few limitations. He must first draw blood from the victim. Then, he must draw a circle on the ground, and perform a ritual to bind his body to the victims. He also can't leave the circle, else the jutsu stops working. And finally, he can cause damage by using his own body as a voodoo doll. The catch is, he's immortal. But his immortality also comes with a condition, that being Hidan must periodically sacrifice someone, through his ritual, to maintain it. How so? His body doesn't regenerate immediately. It's just kept alive, presumably through chakra. There's also the factor of how the ability came to be in the first place. Each Akatsuki member is emblematic of a human fault, which adds yet another layer of meaning to them. Kisame stands for betrayal, Deidara to hedonism and rebellion, Kakuzu to greed, Pain to pride, Konan to blind loyalty, and so on. Hidan is written to embody religious fanaticism. Just like other similar deities in Naruto, Kaguya aside, Jashin is a human construct created through chakra, through man's creativity that was imbued with their spiritual and mental and physical powers. This fact makes Hidan seem even more deranged and simultaneously foolish, as well as proportionately threatening. He's a minor, yet incredibly well-written character. Though Hidan's ability is very creative by itself, the way Kishimoto reveals it through a mysterious, strategic, and highly engaging fight, its iconic visuals, how well it fits with the character that created it, and the way he makes the protagonist deal with it, and also the lore surrounding it, make it exceptional. And it's just Hidan's ability, and he is the least important Akatsuki member. Unlike most shonen, Naruto masters the art of showing, not telling. In contrast, Hunter x Hunter fails at adhering to it as a rule, quite frequently, and so do similar battle shonen, like Jujutsu Kaisen, and, most notably, Bleach. It's especially jarring in Bleach. To be clear, the issue is not with any thoughts or explanations, but with excessive ones that the story would have been better without, or with poorly written ones. I often remember this scene in the Chimera Ants arc, where an irrelevant ant over-explains every single action of a single exchange between him and Gon.
That sure was a close one. You have a lot more power than I was expecting.
Damn, these guys are tough. They have the hard shells of insects, combined with the agility of humans.
I wonder what's running through your mind right now. What is this power overflowing from his body? Any closer, and I could get seriously injured. He's preparing to launch an attack dozens of times more powerful than the last one. I have no choice. I'll sacrifice my 8 left legs to block his punch, while using the right 8 to grab him. It'll work. It's just a punch. No matter how strong it is, I can take it as long as I'm prepared. I'm gonna pretend to attack him while I block his punch. And then, when his guard is down, I'll just grab him up and take a bite. Here goes.
John! Ken!
Just like I thought. Block! Scissors! What? No! A sword? Impossible! Hold on a minute. This could still work out in my favor. I can pretend I'm dead, then wait for an opportunity to bite.
The abilities of Father Chimera Ants are also over-explained to a comical degree. Unfortunately, I unironically think most dimwitted shonen watchers would think Naruto to be a smarter series if it were written like that at all times. Finally, before I move on, I also want to mention that Nen is way less integrated into Hunter x Hunter's worldbuilding than Chakra is into Naruto's. It's more akin to the Haki system of One Piece in this regard. It is inexplicably a secret. Normies don't know it exists somehow, even though there are entire Nen tournaments that happen within densely populated cities, which are broadcasted, and the internet exists. No conflict in Naruto is simply a physical fight. They are also an ideological and spiritual battle that results in the development of both fighters. Every relevant antagonist presents a specific philosophy or contradiction that must be resolved for him to be truly defeated, and that's in addition to personal and plot-related stakes. As such, every important fight, from start to finish, is layered, imbued with meaning. Their conclusions are always poetic. Their incredible writing extends to their practical resolutions. The majority of them feature creative strategies, multiple twists, and feel tense and impactful throughout. Those that do not are part of a select few that focuses on kaiju spectacle, a staple of Japanese media, and they are a welcome breath of fresh air, a pleasant exception to the rule. And both types of fights feature awe-inspiring, highly dynamic, cinematic choreography. Naruto's fights are by a large margin the best shonen has to offer. Now for an example, I'll comprehensively compare a story-defining fight of Jujutsu Kaisen with one of Naruto. For Jujutsu Kaisen's case, I chose Yuji's fight against Mahito, both for its status as a fan favorite, and because it features the conclusion to Nanami's arc, and he's one of the better written characters. For Naruto's case, I chose Naruto's fight against Pain, because it is the closest parallel to the former. It too is a fan favorite. It happens at the end of a climactic arc, which involved an equivalent figure of an equivalent antagonist organization, a major antagonist which the protagonist was asked to defeat. It is preceded by the death of a character who mentors the protagonist. It seemingly features a character death, and it features a clash of wills, of ideologies between hero and villain. Yuji first meets Mahito when he's dealing the killing blow to Nanami, who had been his mentor for a while. Nanami lost a sorcerer friend and decided to quit the job to become a regular salaryman, but he eventually chose to return to his job as sorcerer because the other one was unfulfilling. He gets fulfillment from helping people. Upon meeting Yuji, he first underestimated him, but after he proved his strength, Nanami recognizes him as a worthy sorcerer. Later, when he's about to die, he daydreams about buying a house on a beach and reading books. Then, he thinks of the friend he'd lost, and in his final words, he entrusts the fight to Yuji, instead of saying something negative that would demotivate him, as he was first intending to. It's likely he thought Yuji would end up like his friend, and thus, almost let his pessimism slip. Though it's rather clear he projected you onto Yuji, this dynamic is not explored as well as it could have been. Upon seeing Nanami die, an enraged Yuji runs at Mahito. Since his only technique is punching with aura around his fists, he can't do much other than evade or block Mahito's attacks and punch him or throw something at him in return. There is not a lot of strategizing going on, and the choreography must rely on Mahito's powers. But then, a twist happens. Mahito manages to kill Nobara, a flat, boring side character, whose only motivation is to be a strong sorcerer, and who has no role to play in the narrative. Her death at the very least brought something to the fight. However, this moment is later ruined, since even though Mahito touches her, and we see her head explode, she is later fully healed except for an eye she lost. I guess the only thing that was truly damaged was her eye. Her brain was left wholly intact. How nice for her that Mahito's ability was used with surgical precision. And to make her pseudo revival even worse, she does basically nothing important until the end of the manga. Reminds me of One Piece's retcon deaths that led nowhere. After a 2-month coma, she conveniently awakes right after Gojo's death. If she'd risen even an hour before, she could have struck Sukuna and created an opportunity for Gojo to kill him, and the story would have ended. After seeing Nobara's head explode, Yuji loses his focus for a moment and lets Mahito beat him up. Then, Todo, yet another flat, narratively pointless, poorly written secondary character, shows up to help Yuji. Though his ability is definitely more interesting than Yuji's, their blows against Mahito don't feel very impactful either, since we don't understand when he's actually being damaged and what he can or can't regenerate. This is a pattern for many of Jujutsu Kaisen's fights. Some characters can even get stabbed in the chest and essentially feel nothing at all. And sometimes some of them can dodge deadly abilities, and other times they can't, for the convenience of the plot. Yuji even beheads Mahito at one point, and he seems rather unfazed. Todo loses one of his hands, then performs a gag with a schoolgirl, and punches Mahito, also causing little apparent damage. Then there's the one clever moment in the fight. Todo lies by claiming his ability still works even without a hand, and claps on his stump, tricking Mahito. Then, Yuji punches him really hard. Mahito, now sufficiently hurt, realizes he's evolved enough to unleash his final form. The two exchange fists. Yuji apparently deals less damage to him now, but his black flashes, his extra super powerful punches, can still overpower Mahito. Before, Mahito had told him that, despite one being a one-dimensional villain, who's a literal incarnation of evil, whose goal is to kill every human being, and the other being a good guy, they are the same. Because Yuji wants to, well, kill the bad guys who are literal incarnations of evil, and whose goal is to kill every human being. One is truly a foil to the other. And now, before defeating Mahito, Yuji brilliantly tells him he's correct, and as they are indeed exactly the same. And the manga depicts Yuji as excessively cold and edgy, while saying that in the most pretentious way possible. Then the corniest metaphor I have ever seen in a manga comes up, as Mahito, whose accurate is to a defenseless rabbit, cries in fear of Yuji, whose accurate is to a wolf. I'm not joking, nor portraying the scene in bad faith. That's about as deep as a TikTok manga like Jujutsu Kaisen gets. Yuji doesn't get to finish Mahito off, because Kenjaku absorbs him. Now, how they sacked Naruto against Pain. Jiraiya left the village to gather intel on, and possibly eliminate Akatsuki's leader, the ever mysterious Pain. While his mission was legendarily written, what's important to note is that he died on duty. Though he might have been able to escape, he chose to fight to the death for the chance of solving the secrets to Pain's identity. And though he'd managed to solve it, he was only able to write a codified hint onto the back of Fukazaku. His death was majorly impactful, though greatly foreshadowed. To fully appreciate Jiraiya's character and his end, I will analyze him in detail, in the same way I will analyze other characters in the second part of this video. Jiraiya's death triggered Naruto's training at Mount Myoboku. There, he learned and eventually perfected the Sage technique, but near the end of his training, the leaf was invaded by Pain. The Hokage, Tsunade, refrained from calling Naruto to help them as to not endanger his life, and the village's forces fought with all they had. A variety of characters fought against the Six Paths. The leaf was being destroyed, bit by bit, and characters died, but nobody snitched Naruto's location, for they'd grown to respect and cherish him as one of their own, showing us character development for the whole of the leaf regarding their view of the protagonist. While this was happening, a political conspiracy was taking place in the background. Danzo was doing what he could to enable the leaf's destruction, so he could become the next leader. Pain unleashed his divine wrath and ruins the entire village, killing most of its citizens. The stakes could not be any higher. The setup for Naruto's fight against Pain is a masterclass in building tension. And then, Naruto appears on top of a giant toad, who's on top of a giant toad, who's besides two giant toads. That sight alone shows how far he's come, from struggling to summon Gamabunta in part 1, to being respected by all frogs. He's using Sage Mode, which he masters better than his teacher. He's also wearing Jiraiya's coat, signifying he inherited his will. He was summoned to the crater that was once the leaf, and is surprised upon learning where he is. Then, Pain summons his other paths, and Tsunade jumps in to confront them. She's almost struck, but in one move Naruto saves her and destroys one of the enemies. Note how each and every attack has weight. You feel every jutsu, every punch, as do the characters. This is the norm for Naruto. Otherwise, tension would be diminished, and we would neither feel the enemy's threat nor the hero's might. Every interaction has meaning. Tsunade sees specters of Minato and Jiraiya behind Naruto, showcasing again his growth as a shinobi. What ensues is a tactical fight, for which Naruto employs every technique he knows. He had also prepared himself for this fight, and made clever use of his clones. Two of them were stationed at Mount Miyaboku to channel Sage energy, so he'd be able to prolong the duration of his Sage Jutsu by undoing them, and taking the energy for his real self, a mechanic already established in the series. The fight is very difficult, as he's facing 6 different bodies, each with a unique ability. After a while, Naruto is captured, but in a twist, manages to escape by cleverly channeling Sage energy through his captor, which turns him into a frog statue. The Deva Path kills Fugaku and sends Naruto into shock, and then he slams him onto the ground and binds him with his chakra rods. Pain, however, is not done with Naruto. Upon being asked why he's doing this, he feels compelled to answer. Out of a sense of justice, perhaps mixed with human guilt, he seeks to justify his actions, which he believes stand for the greater good of humanity, for universal peace. And the argument he provides for his cause is quite sensible, so much so that Naruto can't refute it, and by learning of Pain's past, of the actions committed against his village, he seems, indeed, justified and not too dissimilar from Naruto himself at that moment. Pain's words hold true meaning and weight. Before Pain could take Naruto away, Hinata jumped in to free Naruto, and Pain nearly kills her. In response, Naruto is consumed by anger, and finally unleashes the Kyuubi, which he'd been restraining until then. He shatters Hashirama's crystal, and gets close to fully possessed. This was the payoff to the build-up that had been set up since the very start of the series, which progressed naturally throughout it, and it feels amazing and suspenseful to witness. How will Naruto deal with the aftermath of his possession? Now the situation is inverted. Pain is on the defensive, as he must deal with the enraged Nine Tails. He performs his most powerful technique, the Chibaku Tensei, and confines Naruto within a planetoid, as Nagato mentions the legend of the moon's creation by the Sage of the Six Paths, who Pain is modeled after, as an inversion. His Chibaku Tensei is a godlike feat, but as the legend implies, it is not as powerful as what had come before. That is foreshadowing for what would come much, much later in the story. One must wonder what the sage has to seal within that big of a Chibaku Tensei, and the story has been showcasing a very organic power progression. As Naruto is sealed in the sphere, he drifts into his inner self, and Kyuubi attempts to lure him into a falchion bargain. As he's about to open the gates and free the Great Demon, his father appears before him. The two exchange words for the first time in a highly emotional scene. Naruto finally experiences paternal love. Reassured of his resolve, Naruto is in control of himself again and confronts Pain one final time. He employs a smart tactics to defeat the Deva Path, and the reader can feel that both the protagonist and the antagonist have spent nearly all of their energy. This duel seems tired and desperate. Deva's Akatsuki uniform has become a rag. Upon incapacitating Deva, he pierces himself with one of his chakra rods to locate Nagato, yet another clever idea of his. Upon meeting Nagato, the two debate with each other once more, but this time, Naruto has thought of a way to overcome Pain's words. through forgiveness, breaking the cycle of hatred between the two. And he offers Nagato a new hope by promising to never forsake his strict ideals of peace. Though Nagato had become incredibly pragmatic and had lost his faith in humanity over his life, he decides to entrust his life to Naruto, admitting defeat, and sacrifices himself to at least alleviate the damage it caused. His vast chakra is fully consumed, so his victims are brought back to life. Both Naruto and Nagato underwent a great deal of character development, hence their fight reflected the manga's major themes, and paid off multiple things that had been built up. It was brilliantly written from start to finish, and that is the norm for Naruto's fights. Its repercussions rippled through the following arcs. Due to Tsunade nearly dying to heal the citizens of the Leaf, she wouldn't be able to attend the Kage Summit, and Danzo has to go in her place, triggering the next arc. And in that arc, Naruto's new resolution is put to the test. This arc also evolves the theme of destiny. The child of prophecy was to become either Christ or Antichrist, that is, either a savior or a destroyer. It is but the greatest archetype. And we learn that both Nagato and Naruto fit that archetype. They both were the child of prophecy. And not only that, but Naruto redeemed his equal for that very reason. He, like Nagato, could have underwent a path of destruction, as was laid out by the prophecy, yet he chose one of love, and as such, could empathize with his parallel, as he has done to Haku, to Gaara, and as he would do to Sasuke, and so on. It's a deeply pneumatic plot point. Before I begin the analysis of Naruto, I'll quickly explain how it is structured. I will talk about each major antagonist of the story, in semi-chronological order. Occasionally other important characters will be discussed. The analysis of the characters' writing will sometimes be supplemented by an analysis of their designs, which will serve to demonstrate how Naruto has been able to use the strength of its medium, which is the blending of literature, visual art, and cinematic composition, in an unprecedented way. That is, how Naruto celebrates its nature as a manga. The use of characters' abilities as symbolic representations of their souls and minds, of their personalities and ambitions, and of their narrative roles is a recurring pattern in Naruto. Each relevant character was carefully crafted by Kishimoto, as I will make clear. And while that isn't an aspect unique to Naruto, it is in Naruto where it is most impressively realized. As you will come to understand, Naruto is incredibly deep, though that depth went unnoticed, for as explained before, Kishimoto treated his readers with the utmost respect for their intelligence, and as such, concealed layers of meaning in subtext, details, and symbolism. I will be revealing that which he gracefully hid. Although Zabuza and Haku are the antagonists of the first arc of the story, their narrative relevance is immense. It is through them that Kishimoto begins to explore the concept of a shinobi, and many of the main themes addressed by the story, such as the necessity and consequences of war, generational and systemic trauma, the redemption of the human soul, the cycle of hatred and violence, etc., revolve around this idea. So, what is a shinobi? A shinobi is a tool, a soldier spy, a military agent whose humanity doesn't matter in the face of their duty to their cause and superiors. Through Zabuza's past, we are introduced to the first example of institutional abuse in Naruto. As a child, he was forced to face and kill friends and village peers in an initiative aimed at creating perfect shinobi. Students who graduated from the Mist Academy were forced to participate in this deadly game to complete their training, and those who showed exceptional talent for killing were made candidates for the village's elite shinobi group, the Seven Swordsmen of the Mist, a group Zabuza became part of. Practices like this are recurring in the cruel world of Naruto. The ideal shinobi is one who abandons his humanity to become a perfect tool, one who has no emotion, who has been desensitized to the point of losing contact with their soul, a machine of espionage and assassination made of flesh and bone, or, in Zabuza's case, a demon. Zabuza sought a way to help his nation. He plans to execute a second coup d'etat after failing the first, to overthrow the current regime which had created him, and for this purpose he trained Haku, an orphaned child who had also been victimized by the cycle of violence, who possessed incredible potential as a shinobi, which Zabuza aims to cultivate. Initially, Haku was supposed to be a girl. but one of Kishimoto's editors advised him to change the character's gender to avoid the relationship between Zabuza and Haku being misinterpreted by readers. However, it's clear that what Kishimoto wanted to represent with these characters is a subtextual father-daughter relationship, a platonic bond between two beings who were broken by the system that made them, but found support, love, and peace in one another, even though their duties suppressed this bond. Haku's biological father, traumatized by past wars, yet another victim of the cycle of hatred, tries to kill him upon discovering Haku's Kekkei Genkai nature, seeing him as a demon, not as a human being. This created a void in Haku's chest. Zabuza, in contrast, filled it by recognizing Haku's intrinsic talent and providing him with a sense of purpose, by adopting him as if he were his own child, has broken a father as he may have been capable of being. Zabuza is introduced to us as a two-dimensional villain, a monster who seeks money and power, with no clear reason for it. But this intrinsically evil Zabuza is slowly subverted, brilliantly, to intuitively show the reader the curse of the shinobi world. Just as the characters in the story should not see the antagonists as obstacles to be overcome, the reader is instructed to do the same, and reflect upon the human condition. Zabuza and his team serve as a parallel to Team 7. Zabuza is the teacher of 3 shinobi students, how children like Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. Kakashi could have been no different from Zabuza if only he hadn't listened to Obito's words, which planted in his heart the value of the lives of his comrades. The story demonstrates from the very beginning that Naruto's antagonists are not mere villains. They are what the protagonists would become if their circumstances were different, or if they strayed from their paths. A tease is proven through Sasuke, a deuteragonist who becomes the final antagonist of the story. Zabuza's design reflects his narrative role. His sword, Kubikiribocho, is special. It regenerates its edge and replenishes its iron by absorbing the blood of those who are wounded by its blade, just as a shinobi is affirmed by murdering. The perfect shinobi is the perfect killer, a demon who feeds upon drawing the blood of his targets. Zabuza envelops himself in mist to hide his presence and assassinate his opponents, just as he hides his humanity beneath his role as a shinobi. Haku wears a mask, like many other shinobi, to conceal his identity and operate as an assassin from the shadows. However, the face behind the mask is particularly delicate and angelic, a contrast that is highlighted when the mask shatters and Haku walks towards death. For as dangerous as he is in combat, Haku is also a sensitive child. He possesses a Kekkei Genkai of ice, which symbolically contrasts with his warm heart. He must embrace coldness if he wishes to succeed as a shinobi and please Zabuza. Though, paradoxically, what makes him wish to desire to please Zabuza is his humanity, his human soul, which he knows he must forsake. Furthermore, Haku uses mirrors in his combat technique, which symbolically emphasizes his parallel with Team 7. He's the mirror image of what they'll become should they accept the orthodox path of the shinobi. When Zabuza and Haku face Team 7, in addition to the physical battle, there is simultaneously a psychological tug-of-war. Despite being trained and instructed to become a killing machine, Haku is extremely empathetic, and, moreover, he's simply a child like Naruto, Sasuke, and Sakura. He ends up sacrificing himself for his master and father figure, acting as the tool he was trained to be. However, his sacrifice is also an act of love, just like Sasuke's sacrifice for Naruto moments before. Zabuza could have killed Kakashi if only he seized the opportunity given to him by Haku, but he hesitated, for, in a brief moment, he was unable to desecrate the body of the subordinate, lying dead before him, contradicting his previously unshakable shinobi persona. When Zabuza is confronted by Naruto and hears his pure-hearted speech about compassion, his soldier's armor is finally pierced, and his genuine emotion surfaces for the first time. By shedding tears for his enemies, by seeing them as his equals, as human, Naruto awakens a dormant man inside Zabuza, the demon of the mist. It wasn't any blaze that defeated Zabuza of the 7 ninja swordsmen, but a child's heart. When Zabuza is felled and laid beside Haku's body, his soul is redeemed, and they can ascend to the heavens together. The snow that falls represents the purity of them both, which was subtly manifested in their simple bond, a purity that the cruel and dehumanizing shinobi world didn't allow to bloom. After Zabuza and Haku's burial, Naruto undergoes a moment of introspection and speaks to Kakashi about the nature of a shinobi. As the start of the story, Naruto dreamt of becoming Hokage, simply to gain the admiration of his village, so that everyone would stop hating and fearing him. A dream one would expect from a socially ostracized, orphaned child. But from this moment on, he realizes that the world of Shinobi was built on an ideological falsehood and needs a vast reform. As Kakashi would say years later, it was Zabuza and Haku who helped Naruto discover his own ninja way. Orochimaru is a character whose background is Faustian, and whose role in the narrative is Mephistophelian. He seeks to make Sasuke a victim of temptation, intensifying the darkness he cultivates within himself. While his goal is to take Sasuke's body, this is only one aspect of his obsession with him. The more human side of Orochimaru sees in Sasuke his own reflection, and therefore his envy compels him to dominate him. The narrative develops a parallel between the Sannin and the trio of protagonists, with the new generation surpassing and fulfilling the legacy inherited from the old. However, Orochimaru opposes the will of fire, and thus cannot accept being surpassed by Sasuke and seeks to possess him instead, while both Jiraiya and Tsunade are eager to be transcended by their students. Like many of Naruto's antagonists, Orochimaru was forced to confront the evils of the shinobi world from a very young age. He lost both of his parents to war. This tragedy shaped or accentuated his cold personality and his eccentric ambitions. Later, upon witnessing the losses of his peer, Tsunade, his desire to cheat death was emboldened even further. He sought power and esoteric knowledge, and for this purpose, he gradually shed his humanity, like a snake sheds its skin. He wanted to transcend the human mortality that had frustrated him, so he used his talents to overcome death and become immortal. Orochimaru views others as mere vessels to achieve his goals. Paradoxically, life has lost all meaning to him, and for this reason, he doesn't hesitate to take the bodies of others to prolong his own existence. In his youth, we can see that Orochimaru displayed empathy, still, although this empathy was overlaid by his deep disillusionment. He suggested killing orphans of war to spare them from their suffering, a suffering he knew all too well. When offering to kill Nagato, Konan, and Yahiko, he projected himself onto those three, and thought they'd be better off dead. At his core, Orochimaru never overcame the grief and alienation he felt. The dark enlightenment he sought had the goal of creating a jutsu capable of bringing the deceased back to life. This is why he went after, and studies the Edo Tensei technique, and why he lured Tsunade with it. As sociopathic as he is, he was still able to empathize with Tsunade, and thus understand her deepest desires, which mirrored his. He later used the Edo Tensei to kill his former master, the third Hokage, who was a symbol of the shinobi world he rebelled against, which had created him. The Edo Tensei is a technique that expresses the themes of Naruto in a succinct and clear way. Through human sacrifice, the user can resurrect the dead and control them as soulless puppets, as tools of murder. In essence, they are perfected shinobis. The Edo Tensei will be reintroduced later in the story, and much more will be said about the technique in this analysis. The symbolism that accompanies Orochimaru, like much of the symbolism in Naruto, is based on a mixture of Western and Eastern cultural, mythological, and religious elements. The snake, in addition to being a symbol of immortality, greed, coldness, rebirth, and renewal, also represents knowledge and Luciferian temptation, both of which are also deeply aligned with his narrative role. The curse mark references both Eastern mythology, as it features three tomoes in its appearance, and a reference to Western culture and religion. In this case, alluding to the mark of the beast, with the tomoes representing the 666. This is not coincidental. The curse mark is a manifestation of the Faustian bargain, and under its influence, Sasuke becomes progressively more demonic. He symbolically sold his soul to the devil for power. The Sharingan implies the same symbolism, with the Mangekyo representing power, obtained primarily through another kind of satanic exchange. A relevant observation is that even Sasuke's Mangekyo, which superficially seems to deviate from the norm, portrays the 666 in a subtle way. There is a hexagon at the center, 6 triangles, and 6 points on its atomic-looking structure, like in the Seal of Solomon. It's worth noting that the most important atom that defines material life, the carbon atom, has 6 electrons, 6 protons, and 6 neutrons. Esoterically, this number represents material reality, which in the case of Naruto, relates to the curse of the shinobi world. something Sasuke embodies as a microcosm. To further develop this thesis, the origin of the curse mark lies in Yugo's Kekkei Genkai, a technique that absorbs the energy of nature and converts it into power for the user, possessing them with malice in the process. Natural energy is allegorically equivalent to the dragon, which can represent both Satan and God, and both the dragon and the serpent, by extension, which is just an incomplete dragon, represent wisdom. And, in Naruto, those who master the conversion of natural energy are called sages. The dragon is manifested, in its most primordial state, as the Jubi, and the Jubi is described as an incarnation of natural energy, tying everything together. It is also worth mentioning that Yugo's clan acquires their power at Ryuchi Cave, where the Great Serpent resides, yet again a reference to ancient wisdom, to Genesis, and so on. The only exception to the rule of the Mangekyo designs is Shizui's Mangekyo, which has a four-sided pattern. He represents the purest embodiment of the will of fire among the Uchiha, who awakens the Mangekyo, which is why his dojutsu does not allude to the mark of the beast. Shisui is directly compared to Naruto, and his ascendant, Kagami, also proves to be an exception to the norm. He was a devotee of the will of fire, admired even by the second Hokage, Tobirama, who considers the Uchiha a threat to the village. The village hidden in the sound, founded by Orochimaru, operates as almost a hyperbole, a parody of what a shinobi village represents. Its members, Orochimaru's lackeys, are likewise hyperboles of the shinobi of the Hidden Leaf that they face. Less than mere tools, they are Orochimaru's lab rats. Their lives are only worthy, as they are useful to their leader. Despite Orochimaru's legitimate frustration and trauma, his actions served, before his redemption, only to perpetuate the cycles of violence, hatred, and injustice of the shinobi world, the same factors which caused the death of his parents. Orochimaru's death is a case of dramatic irony. He dreamt of making Sasuke his tool, of possessing him, but when Sasuke no longer saw him as useful, Orochimaru himself was discarded. His ambition to use Sasuke for his own ends turned against him, as Sasuke ultimately rejected Orochimaru's influence, as his usefulness to him had ended. When Orochimaru is brought back to life, he abandons his former ambitions. After all, he had witnessed Kabuto's doomed fate, a man who'd chosen to imitate him and carry his ideology to its logical conclusion, and his fascination with Sasuke led him to see the boy as more than just a tool, and he decided to observe him closely, intrigued by the choices that could redefine the shinobi world's cursed fate. When he uses the Edo Tensei a second time, he subverts it entirely. The jutsu that once turned past shinobi into mere weapons of destruction is now wielded to protect the village, and to protect humanity. No longer does it disrespect the dead. Instead, it purifies them in the end. The century-old feud between Hashirama and Madara is finally resolved, and they ascend to the afterlife as brothers. And for the first time, Minato is able to wish his son a happy birthday. Neji adds a significant layer to the narrative by addressing one of its most important themes: how humans deal with their destiny. Neji represents the ideology of fatalism, which proposes that each person's fate is inevitable, and that destiny is a blind force with absolute influence over one's life. Like most of the other relevant antagonists, Neji is also a victim of the unfair shinobi system. His clan structure determines that he would be subordinated to the main branch, and no matter how much he struggled or excelled, he could never belong to the dominant lineage. He was fated to die at the hands of his superiors, should the necessity arise. Members of the subordinate branch are branded with a cursed seal, a swastika, the wheel of life, a symbol of the demiurgic trap of reincarnation, that forces them to serve the main house. If any Hyuga subordinate refuses orders, the seal activates, inflicting excruciating pain that could lead to death by destroying the nerves in the skull. Moreover, upon their death, the Byakugan, the coveted dojutsu and Kekkei Genkai of the Hyuga, are destroyed by the curse to prevent enemies from stealing them. As is the rule for Naruto's antagonists, Neji's situation serves as a microcosmic parallel to a part of the structure of the entire shinobi world. Shinobi are expected to accept their duty unconditionally and sacrifice their lives for the orders of their superiors without hesitation, like tools stripped of humanity. Neji's father, Hisashi Hyuga, was born seconds after his twin brother, Hiashi, and this slight difference in timing sealed his fate as a member of the subordinate branch. Due to a political dispute that could have led to a war between the Leaf and the Cloud, Hisashi was forced to sacrifice himself for his brother, his clan, and his village. The Raikage had sent an envoy to the Leaf, with the mission to sign a peace treaty, but the envoy's primary objective was to steal two Byakugan to strengthen the Cloud's military power. The envoy attempted to capture Hinata, a member of the main house, but was stopped by Hiashi, who kills the invader to protect his daughter. The Raikage, aiming to weaken the Hyuga clan, and by extension, the Leaf's military, demanded retribution. As a result, it was agreed between the villagers that Hiashi would die in compensation for the envoy's death. To avoid the risk of the Cloud obtaining two Byakugan, the Hyuga clan devised a plan, in which Hisashi would be sacrificed instead of his brother, since he and Hiashi were identical twins, and thus the Cloud could not prove the fraud without revealing their true intentions. This tragic story cultivated a bitter hatred in Neji, for his father had been unjustly sacrificed, and Neji believed that his fate would mirror his. This hatred shaped his fatalistic ideology. Neji was also a hypocrite and a rebel. According to his worldview, it should be inevitable that he would live and die as a subordinate, and according to his words, it's foolish to resist such a fate. Yet, he irrationally expresses his hatred, violently, almost killing Hinata, a member of the main house, during the Chunin exams. His internal conflict contradicts the very system he believes in. He refuses to conform but still projects his limited understanding of the world onto others, through both verbal and physical aggression. Despite possessing one of the most coveted pairs of eyes in the shinobi world, Neji cannot see the contradictions that torment him. He fails to recognize the dignity, the potential, and merit of his peers, nor does he see his own. The visual appearance of his Byakugan symbolizes his spiritual blindness. Neji's gentle fist technique is emblematic of his character. Just as it restricts the flow of chakra, that is, the physical and spiritual energy of his opponents, he similarly demotivates them with his words that preach his fatalism. Neji judges it impossible for Naruto to surpass him, believing he's doomed to fail. However, the failure defeats the genius. Naruto's persistence, his refusal to be defined by the expectations of others, exposes the flaw in Neji's worldview. It is after his cathartic defeat that Neji realizes the truth. He learns that his father, Hiashi, had willingly sacrificed himself for his twin brother, a gesture born from love. Neji comes to understand that his father's fate was not determined by the circumstances of his birth, but by his free will and altruism. The bird trapped in the cage had escaped its predetermined fate through genuine, martyrial intent. This realization marks a pivotal moment in Neji's journey, as he sheds his fatalistic beliefs and begins to see the potential for change and choice. Neji's ultimate sacrifice, when he chooses to save his sister Hinata, whom he once hated, is the final act that seals his character arc. He transcends the limitations of his past, choosing to follow the path of his father. From a young man who viewed his life as governed by an unchangeable fate, Neji becomes a symbol of the power of choice and redemption. His story is one of growth, where the rejection of fatalism and acceptance of free will allow him to find peace and purpose. Neji's final act of selflessness represents his triumph, and in doing so, he broke free from the chains of destiny. It's like the epiphany of the alchemist, who realizes the only way to attain eternal life is, paradoxically, through a sanctified death. Gaara, as an antagonist, serves as a mirror to Naruto, the protagonist of the story. He represents what Naruto could have become if he had not received Iruka's love, and if he had surrendered to his hatred, and embraced the negative perception that everyone had of him. Accuse someone of being a monster, and that person may indeed become monstrous. Gaara, like the other Jinchuriki, was feared and ostracized because of the demon living within him. Unlike Naruto, he could not cope with his loneliness, and thus, he follows the path of violence and terror, shaping his identity around his infamy. Gaara's suffering is also a product of the system that created him. His father, the fourth Kazekage, faced difficulties in his position. His village was at risk of extinction because its military strength could not compete with its rivals, and therefore he decided it was necessary to enhance the power of the Sen Shinobi. To this end, Rasa chose his son to become a Jinchuriki, just as Naruto was chosen by his father to house the Kyuubi. But unlike Minato, who trusted his son's potential, and even after his death, showed unconditional paternal love and understanding for Naruto, Rasa saw Gaara as a weapon of mass destruction. When Gaara showed emotional weakness, Rasa began to see him as a failure. Fearing for the people of his village, Rasa commanded Gaara's maternal uncle and caretaker, Yashamaru, to attack him both physically and psychologically to test him. Yashamaru lied to Gaara, telling him that he hated him, just as his mother, who died shortly after giving birth, had hated him. All of this served only to fuel the malice growing in Gaara's heart, and he was now completely alone. Gaara began to abuse his position as Jinchuriki, to act without scruples, killing anyone who bothered him indiscriminately. Gaara's son, which supposedly acts autonomously and relentlessly to protect him as a defense mechanism of his Biju, Shukaku, is a symbol of his shinobi prowess, but also, conversely, of his emotional fragility. The body of Gaara had never been scratched, but his soul was in tatters. However, within Gaara lies a child who just wants to be loved, and to love, yearning for a single look of empathy, symbolized by the most genuine meaning of the mark on his forehead, which he drew himself, and which means love. And precisely because he has experienced this same pain, Naruto sees the true Gaara and is able to redeem and purify his human soul through fraternal words. When confronting Sasuke in the Land of Iron, an adult Gaara sees the shadow of his past in him and tries to pull him away from the darkness. The parallel between Sasuke and Gaara had already been drawn in the past, but now it has fully materialized, as the character arc of one develops to be the inversion of that of the other. Gaara sheds a tear for his enemy, as Naruto has done for him. Gaara's development culminates with him becoming the commander of the forces of the Shinobi Alliance, a young man who was once a monstrous child, the product of the hatred generated by the ninja world, and was hated by all, and lived in absolute solitude, became a leader for the universal army of humanity. His speech demonstrates his maturity and serves to foster camaraderie and empathy among the many shinobi who united after centuries of war between their nations. Later, the lie that had been one of the main causes of his suffering was turned around in a twist. His mother had loved him, unconditionally, from the very start. While Gaara primarily serves as a mirror for Naruto, Kimimaro serves the same role for Sasuke. He represents what Sasuke would have become if he completely surrenders to Orochimaru's bargain, gaining vast power but renouncing his individuality and ambition, ultimately reducing himself to the role of a tool in the process. Like Sasuke's, Kimimaro's Kaguya clan, who, like the Uchiha clan, possess an extremely powerful Kekkei Genkai coveted by Orochimaru, with an origin that is both ancient and divine, was exterminated after attempting to attack the Hidden Mist village, much like how the Uchiha clan attempted a coup against the Hidden Leaf village, which would have resulted in a war of immeasurable proportions. Kimimaro is the only survivor of his clan, and for a long time, he wandered without ambition or bonds, as melancholy was festered within. When he met Orochimaru, whom he saw as a father figure, he found a new purpose in life. He would serve as a tool for his new master until the end. However, as a mere tool, his usefulness to Orochimaru faded along with his health. Upon being victimized by a terminal illness, his master simply discarded him. Still, Kimimaro rose from his hospital bed to serve his master one final time, confronting Gaara, the reflection of Naruto who inversely parallels him in his development, to prevent Sasuke from being taken back to the Leaf. Itachi is the personification of the ideal shinobi, a martyr who follows orders, acts in the shadows, and has no scruples. Kishimoto's intention was to take the concept of a shinobi to its extreme with Itachi, which is why he becomes so important to the plot. Itachi betrayed and killed his entire clan for his duty to the village. Was it a heroic act? Is Itachi a hero? Yes and no. He is a victim of the system that created him, as is the case with so many others. From a very young age, Itachi was already surrounded by violence and conflict. He killed for the first time at the age of 4, during the Third Great Ninja War, an experience that traumatized him and helped shape his ideals, which prioritized the greater good, disregarding the means to achieve the ends. He was trained to become the perfect shinobi, and therefore, he is as flawed as the ideals of his society. He personifies them as much as a human can, And in the end, not even Itachi was, truly, the perfect shinobi. He couldn't force himself to kill his younger brother. What the story proposes is that Itachi, the individual, finds redemption, and that his actions are a product of his environment, no matter how cruel they were. Itachi's soul is noble and pure, despite his misdeeds. The reason for Itachi's treatment of Sasuke also becomes clear when we understand the narrative role of both characters. Itachi wanted his brother to inherit his legacy and become a shinobi even better than him, a hero capable of defeating Madara Uchiha and saving the world. To this end, once again, Itachi neglected the means. He subjected Sasuke to the most terrible psychological torture, to solidify in his mind the importance of acquiring power. Itachi also suggested to Sasuke that he kill his best friends to awaken his Mangekyo Sharingan, believing it was the only way for Sasuke to become strong enough to defeat Madara. But Sasuke rejected this advice and decided to follow his own path. He spared Naruto even after defeating him, and because of this, when he faces Itachi in Shippuden, he still does not possess the Mangekyo. Itachi's immense prowess with genjutsu is symbolic of his life, which revolved around manipulation and falsehoods. A shinobi must see through lies, and this is a lesson Sasuke learns the hard way, after being coerced into killing his brother, who loved him dearly. Even though Itachi had great plans for Sasuke, plans to make him a shinobi who would even surpass him, he didn't expect his truth to be uncovered by him, because he had taken extensive measures to prevent this outcome. And this miscalculation caused Sasuke to deviate from the path that had been imposed on him, as he was filled with anger at the unjust and cruel system that had killed his brother and created him. Ironically, for Sasuke to become the ideal shinobi that Itachi had hoped for, he couldn't have had the ability to see through the lies constructed by his brother, which means he would have paradoxically failed his role. Building a castle with illusions is like building a castle with cards. The slightest wind can knock it down. Itachi's crows relates to Ainu mythological symbolism. In Ainu legend, a demon was about to swallow the sun as it rose, and the creator god sent a crow to sacrifice himself to stop the demon and save the dawn. Itachi is that crow who sacrificed himself and his family to stop Kyuubi, a demon, from devouring the leaf. In Shinto mythology, the crow is also a messenger of Amaterasu, the goddess of the sun, whom Itachi's Mangekyo ability is named after. Speaking of it, Itachi's Amaterasu is symbolic of his shinobi nature. Hokage, the title granted to the leader of the Hidden Leaf Village, has a dualistic meaning. It can be literally translated from Japanese as Shadow of the Fire. As Sasuke will say in the future, Itachi acted as a true Hokage should, as a black flame, protecting his village from the shadows. Nevertheless, Itachi's altruism was distorted and corrupted by the shinobi system, and it ended up serving to perpetuate the cycle of hatred and violence that he so despised. Just as Itachi represents for Sasuke his greatest moral, ideological challenge, and his most powerful opponent up until that point, who forces him to use every single ability he'd learned throughout the story, Pain represents the same for Naruto. Just as Itachi is an Uchiha, a survivor of Sasuke's ruined clan, Nagato is an Uzumaki, like Naruto. Kishimoto builds a climactic convergence between the arcs of both characters. While Gaara serves as a mirror for a young Naruto, had he walked the path of hatred, Nagato serves as a mirror for a Naruto, who matured and lost his purity of spirit due to pain and suffering. It's revealed later that Naruto and Nagato share protagonism in the prophecy of the sage Gamamaru, a prophecy that foretells that there will be a student of Jiraiya, who will either destroy or save the world. Pain Shinra Tensei is analogous to the atomic bomb, just as the power of the Bijus he sought to obtain, and Naruto holds the strongest of them within himself. Both possess the power to destroy or save the world. It's through Nagato that the Gnostic subtext of the story is concretely revealed. In chapter 373, Jiraiya mentions the Sage of the Six Paths, considers the founder of the shinobi world, making a direct connection between him and Nagato. When Nagato awakens the Rinnegan, he gains the power of a god, which allows him to either become a messiah, who will redeem the shinobi world, or the Antichrist, who will rule it with divine wrath. Nagato's potential convinces Jiraiya to train him in the ninja arts, and from that moment on, he becomes his master. The design of the Rinnegan represents the control God has over the world. The iris, its center, is surrounded by a pattern that is reminiscent of magnetic waves. It is purple, the color of Aribis, for it combines red and blue, the opposites. The Sharingan of the Uchiha and the life energy of the Senju, the blue chakra. In Nagato's story, we see the journey of a man who becomes a god, a flawed god, both literally and symbolically paraplegic, shaped by hatred, by his human weakness that he believed he'd managed to transcend, but evidently had not. He was crippled physically, and had to operate through dead bodies he controlled as puppets from a machine, and he was crippled mentally and has to justify his acquired misanthropy through a twisted ideology he'd have rejected when he was still pure of heart. An ideology similar to that of Hanzo, the man who'd crippled him, the man he despised. Nagato, just like Naruto, had always been idealistic. He sought a solution to end the war, to end all wars, but gradually became consumed by the hatred around him. What was once a shining dream of world peace turned into a brutal fantasy of power. By creating pain, Nagato symbolically surrenders to his own pain and gives up redeeming the shinobi world, aiming to build peace, not through love, but through fear and destruction. He doesn't intend to end the cycle of hatred, but to use it as an instrument to maintain a disturbed and paradoxically violent peace, acting as a blind and oppressive god with the power to destroy the world. Just as the macrocosmic narrative, the clash between Naruto and Nagato is an allegory for the contrast between the Old Testament and the New, between a punitive god and a merciful god, a disillusioned god and a hopeful, moral, loving god. During their confrontation, Naruto is immobilized and ideologically challenged by Nagato. He didn't know how to respond to pain, and at that moment, surrenders to the cycle of hatred, seeing his enemy as a mere obstacle to be killed, so that a semblance of peace could be restored. The justice Naruto preached by expressing his desire to kill pain is the same justice Pain preached when he destroys the leaf. Naruto evidently needed to mature, and only by going through a symbolic death, giving room for his inner demon, to then be reborn, having heard words of love from his father for the first time, in the spirit realm, did Naruto become ready to see Nagato as an equal, as a broken man who needs empathy to find redemption. Naruto defends his idealism based on the words of the master that he shared with Nagato, and moves his heart by drawing a parallel between him and the protagonist of Jiraiya's masterpiece, his namesake, who was inspired by Nagato. Both of them are Naruto, the protagonist of the story, and both must play the role of savior, usurping the prophecy, shaping their own destinies. By forgiving Nagato, by letting go of the anger derived from his pain, Naruto proves to be a contradiction to Pain's ideology. He breaks the chain of hatred Nagato thought was unbreakable, which he used to justify his plan and worldview. Through love, Naruto redeems the Antichrist. Nagato martyrs himself to finally use his divine power for good, bringing back to life all those he killed in the village. A miracle worthy of a kind, benevolent god. In Shippuden, both Naruto and Sasuke need to mature, to face the deeper issues that govern the shinobi world. Complex, systemic problems that do not have easy solutions. Danzo personifies the dark side of the Leaf Village, and of the traditional ideals of the shinobi world. While Hiruzen led as Hokage, Danzo operated as his shadow. His organization, known as Root, serves to sustain the great tree that was the Leaf, operating in its underworld. This yin-yang relationship was seen as necessary during times of weakness in the Leaf, and despite how cruel Danzo may have been, he proves to be a useful evil for a long time, and always sought to act according to what he genuinely believes to be in the village's best interests, even though his ambition and selfishness sometimes tainted his actions. After Hiruzen's death, Danzo plans to take control of the Leaf for himself. He wanted to cast his shadow over the shinobi world to ensure the supremacy of his village. Danzo represents the ideals of cold, pragmatic, and restricted efficiency that a shinobi of his time was often expected to possess, as well as dark jingoism, in contrast to Naruto's warm, universal ideals of world peace and mutual prosperity. Like the other antagonists of Naruto, Danzo was shaped by his context. His design and abilities are emblematic of his character. He collaborated with Orochimaru to transplant the eyes of the Uchiha he massacred into his arm, and uses them to prolong his life, with a technique that alters reality through the most sublime illusion, Izanagi. the eyes, which lose their light when the technique is activated, act as an allegory to the sacrifice of the Uchiha that Danzo unscrupulously condemns to death to save the village. Danzo also transplanted cells of the first Hokage, Hashirama, into his body. He became a grotesque amalgam of the troubled past of the village, a twisted caricature of the leaf, a dark Rebis. To succeed in killing him, Sasuke ironically has to surrender to his principles. He dehumanized Karin, treating her as a mere tool, a means to an end. He sacrificed her to save himself, and to further his goals, like Danzo sacrificed the Uchiha. The meaning of that act is even deeper, as Karin is an Uzumaki. The Sasuke who sacrificed her would have sacrificed Naruto as they fought to the end, unlike the Sasuke who spared him in the Valley of the End. The ideology Sasuke expresses to Naruto in their final battle was, ironically, deeply influenced by Danzo's. In contrast to him, Naruto fully refutes Pain's ideology. Their paths are diametrically diverging, from the Kage Summit arc onwards. Both Danzo and Tobirama, who are narrative parallels, fought against the Uchiha, but yet again, in a case of dramatic irony, they were the closest to the Uchiha they feared. They too were shadows. Through Kabuto, Kishimoto explores one of the consequences of the Shinobi ideology, the loss of self that comes with the dehumanizing nature of Shinobi conditioning. Kabuto acted as a spy for most of his life. When he lost the only bonds he had, he ceased to recognize himself. He developed an obsessive disorder of absorbing the essence of others, both literally and symbolically, and this serves to make him one of the most complete and formidable shinobi in history. However, it was not enough for him. No superficial ambition was able to fill the emptiness in his chest, and so his journey culminates, after his defeat by the Uchiha brothers, with him returning to serve in the orphanage where he was raised, to help orphans of war like him find their way in the world. Ironically, through his enhanced version of the Edo Tensei, which aims to use the dead as supreme instruments of war, causing emotional instability in the combatants precisely because of their human nature, Kabuto unintentionally helped redeem the disturbed souls of many shinobi, whose deaths had left unfinished business with the living. It's only when sealed by jutsu, or when contacting his own soul, that a victim of the Edo Tensei can free himself from his shackles. In other words, those who'd lost themselves in life could find themselves in the afterlife, ultimately achieving inner peace. Zabuza was able to show his love and gratitude, the feelings he had long suppressed, to Haku. Hanzo was able to regain the dignity he had abandoned, restoring the principles he'd betrayed, like Nagato, his parallel and successor. Raza was able to apologize to his son, whom he had mistreated, and tell him about the unwavering love of his mother, who died without being able to express it to him. Itachi was able to correct his greatest mistake, which was deceiving his brother. By finally working with the truth, Itachi renounces his flawed ideology, finds redemption, and declares his unconditional love for Sasuke, finally freed from his duty as shinobi, and allows to be a true brother. Kabuto, much like Orochimaru, embodies one side of the serpent from the Book of Genesis. He seeks to dominate nature and the material world, yet feels incomplete, even as he declares himself a dragon, which the serpent is an incomplete, inferior version of. Esoterically, the serpent of Genesis was once a dragon. When confronted, it was condemned to crawl upon the earth, its form twisted into that of a lesser being, a serpent. Had Kabuto won the war, his fate would have been self-destruction, like that of the Ouroboros, the greedy, insatiable serpent that devoured its own tail after consuming the world, and reaching cataclysmic proportions. Obito is a character who lost sight of himself, much like Kabuto. The two forming an alliance was no narrative coincidence. Because of the cruel nature of the shinobi world, and Madara's intervention, Obito became the opposite of what he believed he would be in his childhood's dream. The fire of his innocent soul ended up creating a powerful shadow that consumed him. Just like Naruto, Obito was an orphan and never knew his parents. He dreamt of becoming Hokage, to gain the recognition of his peers, a simple dream of an innocent, lonely child, precisely like Naruto's at the beginning of his journey, before it had expanded and matured. The dynamic between Obito and his team also mirrors Naruto's with Team 7. During a mission amidst the Third Ninja War, Obito witnessed Kakashi acting in accordance with the corrupt ideology of the shinobi, abandoning Rin to ensure the success of his duty. Once again, like Naruto, Obito recognized early on the contradiction that curses the shinobi, and therefore, he taught Kakashi a lesson that would shape his character. When sacrificing himself to save Kakashi, Obito's final words were a request for him to protect Rin. The narrative role of Rin is to symbolize the purity and importance of human bonds, the regenerative and empowering potential of empathy. So, when Obito witnessed Kakashi killing her, his worldview, which was based on love, was shattered, and he surrenders to the cursed nature of his condition, bathing in the blood of his enemies, and allowing himself to sink into the darkness of the night. From that moment on, Obito became a mere tool for a greater cause, an empty, dehumanized shell. This development is reflected both in his psychological and visual characterization. Obito is always hiding behind a mask. His identity no longer mattered. He became a full-time actor whose voice and personality serve only his purpose. As Tobi, he impersonated Guru. As the leader of the Akatsuki, he pretended to be Madara. Obito was no longer. During the attack on the Leaf Village, Obito faced his former master, and, in a brief moment, a tiny spark of redemption was ignited. But Minato fails to recognize his former student, seeing him as a mere obstacle to overcome. Despite Minato having defeated Obito in combat, he lost the greater conflicts that was afflicting the shinobi world. And Obito ended up perpetuating the same cycle of hatred which had killed his parents and made him an orphan. He was the one who caused Naruto's solitude. But it didn't matter to him anymore, as he was about to give birth to a perfect world. Obito's main ability, the Kamui Jutsu, is also a reflection of his personality, ambition, and narrative role. It allows him to remove himself from the environment around him, traveling to a voice dimension, isolated from the real world, as well as to pull people he touches into this void. The Kamui dimension is an allegory for the false reality of the infinite Tsukuyomi and for his empty heart. It is barren, of pure matter, made of black cubes, and his magnetic touch is an allegory for the dark temptation he proposes. Upon becoming the perfect Jinchuriki of the Ten Tails, he brandishes a sword shaped after a DNA strand that is made of dark matter, which is the combination of the 5 elements, a reference to the primordial chaos which the Jubi embodies. A foolish chaos that can only be countered by sage techniques, that is, by a manifestation of enlightenment, that also channels the energy of nature. He bears 2 horns on his head, symbolizing, of course, the devil's horns, the false enlightenment. Esoterically, Obito also represents the archetypal Antichrist. More specifically, he references Dajjal, the Islamic Antichrist, a man blinded in one eye, an attribute that represents his spiritual blindness, who will tell lies and claim to be God, with the disbelief manifested as a mark on his forehead, which the third eye that would conjure the infinite Tsukuyomi would become. As the Antichrist, Obito wished to create a false paradise on Earth. He becomes the alchemical Rebis, the magnum opus, the union of opposites empowered by the dragon, whose dark iteration allegorically represents Satan, and which in Naruto is represented by the Jubi, as previously explained. The Blood Moon, which is referenced by the very name of Obito's organization, the Akatsuki, which phonetically means Red Moon, represents his reign and the union of the sun and the moon, of yin and yang, of the masculine and feminine. And as a complement to the observation regarding the alchemical Rebis, both the awakening of the Rinnegan, the Dojutsu of God, which requires the union of opposites, Orochimaru and Kabuto, the effeminate and satanic serpent man, Zetsu, the white and black homunculus, empowered by Kaguya, Naruto and Sasuke's reconciliation that was sponsored by the sage, and other scenarios are all based upon this concept. As mentioned before, Kishimoto drew heavy inspiration from both Eastern and Western mythology, religion, and esotericism, and Naruto is incredibly pneumatic. Despite everything, Obito genuinely believes that his dream was benevolent, not knowing of its hidden consequences, and he intended to conjure the infinite Tsukuyomi with his own eyes, in such a way that he himself would be excluded from his paradise, never able to reunite with Rin. He intended, from the start, to live eternally as a dark martyr, suffering a pitiful and lonely existence, until the end of time, while the rest of humanity experienced infinite and perfect joy. He, who is void, would absorb all of the sorrows of the world, and within him, men would be united together. By redeeming Obito, Naruto once again proves to be the true Messiah, the Christ who will redeem the Shinobi world, by preaching the message of peace, the distillation of good from the New Testament. And it is through Obito's redemption that his soul can finally rest alongside Rin's. Madara's journey led him to deeply understand the nature of the Shinobi world. The duality that governs reality is adequately perceived by him as a curse. In other words, the logical conclusion of his ideals is the abandonment of this reality. The world is inherently corrupt and cannot, nor does it deserve to be redeemed. He intended to sacrifice the future of humanity for a short-term solution through the creation of a dream world. Madara stands as the absolute opposition to the will of fire, which teaches that the new generations should inherit the will of their ancestors, so that the pains of the world are gradually eased, and a better future remains ever visible on the horizon. He represents the peak of realistic pessimism, contrasting with Hashirama's idealistic optimism. Madara's characterization is, ironically, the epitome of duality, a sensitive soul who rejects the world for its death, pain, hatred and sorrow, but also a fighter of divine efficiency, fascinated by war, who delights in facing worthy opponents. A perfect machine of death. It's a contradiction that Madara understands better than anyone. He is fully aware of his hypocrisy, unlike the other antagonists of the series, who fail to recognize theirs, and thus can be refuted. He is not swayed by words, never stopping to reconsider his ideals while fighting. The only thing that can stop Madara is his defeat in combat, and that can only happen if all Shinobi unite under one banner, which would, conversely, prove his hopeless worldview wrong. It's the collective versus the individual. This dualistic aspect of Madara is reflected in his yin, Hashirama, a dreamer who seeks a future of peace and hope, but who would not hesitate to stab his best friend, his family, or even his son in the back for the greater good, not seeing them as human beings, but as obstacles. Hashirama too had his character shaped by duality. His last act was as a hypocrite, like Madara, and this attitude reverberated for generations after his death, such as when Itachi was coerced into massacring his clan. The leaf was created to unite the clans that had fought for so long, and abolish the need for children to become vulnerable soldiers. But its foundation was based on a corrosive falsehood, a one-sided power dynamic between the Uchiha and the Senju, as Madara recognized. The yin did not correspond to the yang. Madara is the human who most closely resembles the concept of the ideal shinobi, the perfect killing machine whose humanity is entirely set aside while fulfilling his duty. He sees his allies as tools, never hesitating to betray them when he deems it necessary. Madara, as the ghost of the Uchiha, manipulates the shinobi world like a puppeteer, orchestrating wars, death, and conflict for the absolute peace he sought to create. He always demonstrated cynicism, trusting only in himself, and never liked having anyone at his back. Ironically, when discoursing about the flawed nature of the world, Madara was describing and condemning himself, and prophesizing his own future. His plan, as meticulous as it was, did not come to fruition as he expected. Even Madara, as perfect as he was human, and his human vulnerability, the arrogance that caused him to lower his guard, was the cause of his end, for the second time. By walking the path he chose, Madara found he couldn't even trust his own shadow, a poetic end for the man who sought to be the last shinobi. The creation of the shinobi came out of necessity. Humanity had always been in conflict with itself. The morality of the world of Naruto is not black and white, but grey. It has been cursed with hatred and division since its origin. Cursed with duality, as Madara explained in his speech to Obito. It is here that Kaguya's narrative role lies. Kaguya represents the demiurge. Her design and characterization align with the common descriptor of the blind, or stupid god, united with the ironic image of Sophia, her counterpart, as well as the mythological Kaguya, as in the Princess of the Moon, whose origin lies in the oldest known Japanese prose fiction, cleverly complementing the primordial origin of the character in Naruto. Under this context, Kaguya represents the vengeful and jealous god of the Old Testament, the creator of the imperfect material world. in Naruto's case, of the Shinobi world. And the story could not be definitely concluded without addressing the issue that lies at the root of everything. Kaguya's chakra tree is the mechanism through which she extracts the physical and spiritual energy from humans, and it represents both the tree of knowledge and the tree of life, with the chakra fruit symbolizing the fruit of knowledge, which granted humanity the concept of good and evil, just as chakra granted them ninshu, the art of peace and dialogue, and ninjutsu, the art of war and power, as well as the fruit of life, for it possesses man's vitality as well. Kaguya reappears to reclaim what was once hers, seeing the humanity who'd received her gift as a failed experiment, which is ironic considering their nature is a mirror to her own. She is a hypocritical, narcissistic mother. With the fall of Madara, it is revealed to us that Zetsu is not his creation, but the personification of Kaguya's will, her shadow, as Satan is to the demiurge. Zetsu is Satan, the tempter of the world. He is, in a concrete sense, the only truly ideal shinobi that ever existed, an inhuman tool, without autonomy or a soul. And it's for this symbolic reason that Zetsu was the primary enemy of the shinobi world in the Fourth Ninja War. His very name means to sever, extinction, suppression, and despair. Zetsu personifies all of his name's meanings. Moreover, Zetsu also represents duality itself, possessing a white and black half, and its form is based on the Venus flytrap, a carnivorous plant that, as its name suggests, acts as a trap for unsuspecting insects, drawn by its nectar. Zetsu was never Madara's ally, but rather a trap planted to eliminate him. Kaguya could only be defeated through the union of opposites, the fusion of yin and yang, of sun and moon, which had not been fully realized since the primordial days when the progenitors of the shinobi ruled, Hagoromo and Hamura, had united to defeat her. The curse of Indra and Ashura could only be overcome when Naruto broke the chains of his destiny and saw Sasuke as his brother, just as worthy of redemption as the flawed world that had plunged him into darkness. And conversely, when Sasuke accepted his own role as Naruto's equal. By sealing Kaguya together, and later reconciliating as brothers, Naruto and Sasuke mended the two original sins of their world. The spread of chakra to humanity by Kaguya, which mirrors Eve luring Adam into eating the fruit of knowledge, and which resulted in the creation of ninjutsu, and consequently of the shinobi, and the rebellion by Indra, which mirrors both Lucifer's rebellion against God, and, as will be discussed in greater depth, Jacob's betrayal of Esau. Through Naruto's universal peace, the world is united by chakra. Through ninshu, the distilled goods that comes from it, just as true good, true enlightenment came from knowledge of the fruit, and can be separated from the bad. After countless generations, the dream of the primordial ancestor of shinobi had been fulfilled through Naruto, the ultimate carrier of the Wheel of Fire. Madara's, and later Kaguya's defeat, made true pain's words about the necessity of a supreme antagonist to force humanity to cooperate, who then switched to Sasuke, but Naruto would go as far as confronting that very antagonist, not to slay him, but to redeem him, proposing a different path, a path of hope and understanding, a path of ninshu. In the end, Sasuke was the only man who could embody, fully, that terrible role, and Naruto, being his brother in soul, was the only man who could embrace him and end the eternal war of man against man. Fate had pushed one to fight the other to the death, yet Naruto rejected it. Sasuke embodies the culmination of the ideals of the shinobi world. His proposed revolution is a dark epiphany born from centuries of hatred and conflict. He more prominently absorbs the ideologies of two major rivals of himself and Naruto, creating a complete synthesis. He would become the perfect shinobi, one who had never existed before, who, like Itachi, would become a martyr for the sake of peace, a universal shadow leader, but unlike him, would not be hindered by bonds, and who, like Pain, would become a punitive god and unite humanity under a single banner, absorbing all hatred into himself. The influence of Danzo's ideals is also particularly notable. Sasuke would act as a foundation that supports world peace, as Pain sought to do. According to Sasuke's ideology, the legitimate Hokage is not the one who is recognized by all, but the shadow who carries all the hatred of the shinobi world alone, as his brother Itachi did in the Leaf, and as Danzo wished to do. Sasuke would eliminate wars by erasing the past, through executing the 5 Kages, and sealing the Biju forever, becoming one with the inherent darkness of reality, creating a future where shinobi understand each other through hatred, and this hatred would be centered solely on himself, the supreme martyr. Just as the flood in the Old Testament was meant to purify the world through divine judgment, serving as a brutal call for renewal, the central, macrocosmic conflict in Naruto can be allegorically compared to the clash between the Old Testament and the New, as already alluded to. Just as the peace Pain sought to create, the peace Sasuke aspires to is based on a contradiction. The future Sasuke envisions is one where hatred is cultivated beneath a thin, translucent veil, and Sasuke's duty would be like a shackle that would make him hostage to a bitter existence of absolute solitude, just like Itachi's. And just as he hated Itachi, perceiving him as a monster, so would the world hate him and perceive him as one, which he would indeed be. The blood tears of the Uchiha are emblematic of their curse, of the hatred that is born from love. When fighting Zabuza and Haku, it was Sasuke who instinctively contradicted the flawed ideals of the shinobi by sacrificing himself for his friend, even though he didn't fully understand the nature of his impulsive gesture. At that moment, Naruto was on the verge of surrendering to the cycle of hatred, accepting the inevitability of violence by attempting to take Haku's life. Throughout his journey, Naruto is also tempted by his own Faustian bargain, and like Sasuke, nearly allows hate to consume him. It's only through the maturation of his empathy that he could manifest his conviction and reach the souls of each of his adversaries. An empathy that before it had attained wholeness, was unable to fully encompass Sasuke during their first climactic duel at the Valley of the End, as Naruto saw his friend as an obstacle, threatening to drag him back by force, disregarding his anguish, and for that reason Naruto was defeated. The next time they exchanged blows, both had become great shinobi, and therefore could meet on the spiritual plane through Ninshu. Naruto has the necessary empathy, but lacks the conviction, which he would only achieve after confronting his Jungian shadow, which had until then been personified by Kyuubi, his literal inner demon, and accepting and redeeming himself. Sasuke, on the other hand, was blind, both literally and spiritually, and went further down that path before he could reconsider his ways. Contrasting Naruto's, his empathy had been killed by darkness, as he deepened his traumas and forgave no one, not even himself. And also contrasting Naruto's, his conviction was fiercer than ever before. The converging development of Naruto and Sasuke is perfectly, meticulously written, as a yin-yang, from start to finish. Naruto sees in Sasuke more than just a friend, a brother and an effigy of himself. Their journeys occurred synchronously. Naruto was able to experience much of Sasuke's pain, from his loneliness to his hatred. One's path represents the love born from hatred, while the other represents the hatred born from love. When Sasuke killed Itachi and learns the truth about him, he surrenders to hatred, and his pure, immeasurable love was converted into fuel for his revenge. Since he was introduced, Sasuke understood himself as an avenger, and the nature of his revenge evolves and becomes more complex as the series progresses, just like Naruto's dream of becoming Hokage. In his childhood, the revenge he desired was simple. He wanted to kill his brother and bring justice to his clan and its reputation. But as the characters mature, the world around them reveals itself to be more complex. Itachi symbolizes a microcosm of the shinobi world. The Leaf Village, the new target of Sasuke's revenge, also symbolizes this. And finally, at the end of the series, Sasuke desires to reduce that rose to ashes, creating something new from it through a revolution. As superficially foolish as Naruto may seem, he nurtured profound wisdom through his worldview, which was gradually shaped by his empathy. He discovered, intuitively and unconsciously, a cosmic law. As is above, so is below. Thus the macrocosm is a reflection of the microcosm. How could Naruto save the shinobi world if he couldn't redeem a brother? A brother who'd become a reflection of the darkness of his context. The curse of Indra and Ashura is based upon the curse cast by the god of the Old Testament against the twins Esau and Jacob. Ashura is Esau, the man emblematic of the raw energy of nature, of the principle of the sun. And Indra is Jacob, the brother who couldn't accept his status and tries to steal Esau's birthright and blessing, who's emblematic of the principle of the moon. And just like how Esau forgave Jacob for his misdeed, Naruto forgave Sasuke for his, and both reconciliated as brothers, ending the eternal feud that had split them. Sasuke has to overcome his Luciferian pride, the Luciferian pride of the Uchiha, and accept his place as the Shadow of the Fire, which both Indra and Madara had rejected. There is no fire that casts no shadow. That is the natural balance. When Naruto finally defeated Sasuke at the Valley of the End, he healed a generational wound, the cycle of hatred was broken, and the fate of the Shinobi world was freed from past burdens. Sasuke, who'd intended to carry the weight of the entire world on his shoulders, saw himself, for the first time, freed from his anger, and accepted Naruto as his equal. Though they had lost their arms, their spirits joined hands where their blood mixed, just as the statues of Hashirama and Madara, upon which they rest, performed the gesture of Shinobi reconciliation amidst the ruin. The true revolution is finally synthesized through the union of opposites. The Sannin are failed parallels of the three main characters. They are legendary shinobi, yes, but they are deeply flawed individuals, and each would be supplanted by their next generation equivalents. They'd build upon their foundations and correct their mistakes, overcoming them both as shinobi and as people. Tsunade was a warm, loving person, but her tender heart was put in chains, first by the loss of her lover, and second by the loss of her younger brother. She was still the same, deep down, but her affection would never be allowed to transpire. Her extraordinary and tragic misfortune is ironic in relation to the gambling habits she developed. It's as though she's trying to cope with her terrible luck by challenging fate, yet she always loses. The only gamble she would ever truly win was her bet on Naruto, Nawaki's mirror image, who inherited his will and would fulfill his dream on his behalf. There's a subtextual romantic triangle implied between the Sannin, as there was, explicitly, between Team 7. Tsunade had a crush on Orochimaru, and Jiraiya had a crush on Tsunade. But Orochimaru was too cold and distant from his early losses, which had profoundly scarred him, and as such, could never bring himself to love. And Tsunade would later become deeply traumatized by the death of her lover, to ever consider a romantic relationship again. And Jiraiya was shaped by his rejection by Tsunade, so much so that he develops the hobby of writing romance stories, as well as his perverted habits, which came in large part from his loneliness, from reserving himself, romantically, to Tsunade, and never being reciprocated. Naruto may have become like him if he hadn't attracted Hinata, and moved on from Sakura, and Sakura may have become like Tsunade if she had lost Naruto, and Sasuke may have become like Orochimaru if Naruto hadn't helped him, if he'd given up. But Team 7 would mend that broken triangle. Sakura, who represents the eternal spring, the joyful, unconditional feminine love, never gave up on Sasuke and was able to forgive him despite her trauma. Naruto was able to mature and overcome his rejection by Sakura, and found true love in Hinata, and Sasuke was able to accept his failures, seek forgiveness, and break the chains which once afflicted his heart. Now that the story was comprehensively analyzed, the third part will focus on refuting popular criticisms of the series. The previous chapter of the video will serve to substantiate some of my arguments. This critique is widely employed not just against Naruto, but against most shonen manga. Most of the time, by tourists whose first anime were watched on Netflix, or by redditors. Those who think about it for even a second will understand that its very premise is incredibly stupid. Can you imagine how deranged you'd sound if you complained that Sailor Moon doesn't have enough male characters that are as developed, prominent, and abundant as female ones in its main cast? Or that a romantic shoujo series is treating its male characters poorly, by writing them to fit the story the female author created with an audience of teenage girls in mind? That's essentially what these tourists do to shonen. Shonen manga literally means boys' comics. People who seriously think Sakura should have been as powerful or as prominent as Naruto and Sasuke are beyond moronic. They complain about that, even though she is perfectly integrated into the narrative to succeed Tsunade as a better shinobi and person. Yes, there are series that feature poorly written, poorly designed female characters, that use them mostly for fanservice or gags, but Naruto is not one of them. Naruto's female characters are as brilliantly written as its male ones. They are just not as relevant as the main protagonists and main antagonists of the story on average. Every female character is treated with dignity by Kishimoto, and many have their own character arcs, exactly like equivalent male characters. Some people take issue with the fact that most women in Naruto aren't tomboys desperate to compete against men, that they aren't men wearing women's skins. Indeed, they are not. If you want to read a postmodernist, second-wave feminist story that is amazingly written, I recommend A Song of Ice and Fire. Though this recommendation will likely ring hollow, as most people who criticize Naruto don't have the capacity to read a book, much less to properly interpret it. In Naruto, female characters are indeed feminine for the most part, and they act in accordance with archetypal feminine roles, the most prominent of which being that of the healer, the nurturing role. Team 7, the Sannin, and Team 6, the three of them being narrative parallels, are composed of one male character emblematic of the sun, one of the moon, and a female character emblematic of the union of opposites. This relationship is even reflected on their color schemes. Naruto is orange, Sasuke is blue, Sakura is pink. Obito is orange, Kakashi is blue, Rin is purple. Jiraiya is red, Orochimaru is purple, Tsunade is green. The female is always between the two opposites. These women are the pillar, the bridge that connects the other two. As Conan, yet another female character who fulfills that purpose, said herself. Sakura punched Kaguya in the story's end, and directed her to the Sun and Moon seals of Naruto and Sasuke. And speaking of Kaguya, Naruto's final antagonist is a character who represents the inversion of the archetype. Its shadow, its evil counterpart, the overbearing mother, the selfish narcissist. Kaguya ruptures the relationship between the two opposites, and they must unite to seal her. This innately feminine role is not in any way inferior to archetypal masculine roles, and most stories written by women, for women, have as their protagonists female characters who manifest the archetype. Most popular novels written by women feature either a love triangle, or a woman who manages to seduce and heal a broken man, so, in the end, the two live happily ever after, or, in the case of tragic stories, do not. Most of the novels of the Bronze Sisters, for instance, feature both love triangles and archetypal healers as their protagonists. In the case of Wuthering Heights, and, in part, Villette, we see the tragic version of this archetypal narrative. In contemporary garbage female literature, we see this as well. Most so-called dark romances, which are, in reality, vile, brain-rotted pornography for women, written by AI, feature such a protagonist, and so on. The way Naruto writes and develops its prominent female characters is remarkably interesting and well executed. As explained before, Tsunade is one of the most nuanced, three-dimensional characters in the medium. Sakura is her successor, and has multiple arcs of her own, and flaws she must overcome. Hinata is Naruto's long-term, true romantic interest, and she has an arc of her own, in which she overcomes her fear and hesitation, due to being inspired by Naruto's words. Her admiration is manifested as love, and she stands as a pillar of support for Naruto in crucial moments, such as in his fight against Pain, during which she proved herself strong-willed enough to sacrifice herself for him, and in the War arc, during which she did the same, and stood by Naruto's side to comfort him when he was about to lose his resolve and succumb to grief. There's Chiyoba, who had an arc-long character arc, which culminated in one of the greatest fights in the series. She was indeed motherly to Sasori, but that doesn't make her any less cool. Ino, like the other minor members of Konoha 11, plays a minor role. She aids in Sakura's coming of age. As an aside, my girlfriend cried while watching their flashback together. Though she had seen shonen like Hunter x Hunter and even Fullmetal Alchemist, which was created by a woman, to her, Naruto was the first whose female characters were relatable. It's not an accident that, out of the big three, or rather, out of any shonen manga or anime, Naruto was the only one with a substantial female fanbase, back when anime and manga were extremely niche in the West. I know some ignorant people will say, but most female characters revolve around male characters. To which I'll say that the male characters also revolve around male characters, and some of them around female characters, because Naruto is a character-centric story. One of the stupidest ships in the history of fiction was of Naruto with his soul brother Sasuke. I could go on, but I've made my point. As a final observation, the anime fails to adapt Sakura properly. It cut a significant number of scenes in which she displayed positive growth, and interacted in cute ways with other characters, and chose instead to emphasize her more negative quirks. Since most people who have experienced Naruto have never, and will never read the manga, the actual source material, and definitive experience, their view of her is twisted. Before talking about Naruto's retcons, I'll quickly define the term. A sober definition of a retcon, as its name denotes, is something that retroactively wrote over the continuity of a work. There are retcons in nearly every single modern work of fiction, and they can be very subtle, and nearly imperceptible, or glaring, and poorly implemented. For instance, an idea can be introduced early on, and be expanded upon as the series continues, with no noteworthy changes to the continuity, even though the author didn't originally plan for each and every expansion, at least not in detail. If noted, those expansions could be considered retcons by some, even though they do not clearly or significantly contradict anything that had been established before. In Naruto's case, there are no egregious retcons. Most of the clearly defined ones are irrelevant, such as the age of a character in a flashback, and pointing them out is no more than nitpicking. To reiterate, there are no relevant, poorly written retcons in Naruto. None. Though I will talk about some of the few significant retcons Naruto does have later in this section. Many things are claimed to be retcons, while they are not. Even though Kishimoto likely didn't think about them before he even began to write the manga, they do not break the continuity at all, and thus aren't truly retcons, but merely additions to the story. The Infinite Tsukuyomi was planned at the very least since the Akatsuki's introduction. Akatsuki contains an epiphanic double meaning in its name. It is translated to dawn, which aligns with Yahiko's original plan, which was to create a new, bright world for the rain. It also phonetically means red moon. Akatsuki, in Japanese, is red moon. It's even smarter when you realize Akatsuki literally means red trust, and is used to communicate daybreak, because the sky is trussed by the red glow of the sun. That's why the flag of Japan features a red circle on its center. But in the context of Naruto, the Infinite Tsukuyomi also thrusts red upon the sky. I know some midwit who doesn't understand subtext and double meaning will notice the kanji not literally being those of Akatsuki, whereas that observation misses the entire point of the pun. And that's confirmed by Kishimoto. By the end of part 1, the main narrative had more or less been planned out, and one can clearly see the foreshadowing of the Reincarnation plot point in that finale. Naruto and Sasuke fight beside the statues of Hashirama and Madara, and Kakashi explicitly comments on the cycle of hatred, and of the eternal, brotherly rivalry between the two mirror archetypes. Pakun says, quote, "Naruto and Sasuke fought here. Ironic, isn't it?" End quote. To which Kakashi replies, quote, "They say this river was created as consequence of the battle between two men, long ago. By gazing at its flow, I feel like I'm watching their duel, which continues eternally unto infinity. Just like the fate of the two men portrayed by these statues, the founders of the leaf. It will be the same for Naruto and Sasuke, as long as they're alive." End quote. Kakashi at that moment realizes Naruto is fated to fight Sasuke to the death, just like Hashirama and Madara fought each other to the death. And we later learn this transgenerational rivalry has been going since the split between their distant predecessors, Indra and Ashura. Yet Naruto manages to break the chain of destiny by forgiving Sasuke, and finally accepting him as his perfect equal. And what happens right after Kakashi's speech? Zetsu appears and says, quote, "It's getting interesting, right?" End quote. We later learn Zetsu has been recording each and every relevant event of the Shinobi world, and furthering Kaguya's master plan from the shadows. Kaguya is not a retcon, and Zetsu's motivation, since his very introduction, has been to advance her plan, and not Madara's. That's why he makes that comment upon seeing Naruto and Sasuke fight nearly to the death. He's not saying that as their duel relates to Madara's plan, but to Kaguya's. People genuinely don't understand Kaguya's sudden appearance. He's precisely the point. Just like the entire Shinobi world, the reader has been deceived by the truest of Shinobi, that is, by Zetsu, and God herself had been waiting to devour humanity all along. Naruto is a deeply Gnostic story, and Gnostic stories are very common in modern Japan, since the 80s, and most Gnostic stories end with God, or a godlike messianic entity, who is, in reality, an imperfect, Luciferian, false god, or a false, anti-messiah, being defeated by humanity. Kaguya is the secret final boss of a JRPG, and is masterfully written as such. And no, Kishimoto never said he didn't know how to defeat Madara in his own story. That is a fabricated quote people somehow believe to this day. Another plot point often assumed to be a retcon is Itachi's twist. It was clear enough from Itachi's very first appearance that he was not who he seems to be. Despite the suspicious inefficiency he displayed, Itachi could easily have captured Naruto had he really tried. Kakashi goes as far as to question why Itachi didn't kill him. planting a seed of doubt into his true motivation and character. Kisame also suspects him and asks why he orders the retreat, to which Itachi responds that the Tsukuyomi left him tired, which is obviously an excuse. Exploring that incident further, Itachi went to the village not with the intention of capturing Naruto, but of alerting the village of Akatsuki's plan, and of sending a message to Danzo that he is not free to go after Sasuke after the death of Hiruzen. Hiruzen had promised Itachi not to allow anyone to go after his brother, and even left the formula to the barrier jutsu that protects the leaf unchanged as to allow him to infiltrate the village should he feel Sasuke is in danger. There's a scene in which a seed of the truth leaks out in chapter 7, before the first arc of the story even. Upon reflecting about the Uchiha massacre, Sasuke says, quote, "That's time, ... crying, ... my, ... end quote." And to conclude this part about Itachi, Kishimoto himself confirms he'd planned Itachi having been a victim of circumstance from the very moment he was introduced in the story, when Sasuke told his team of his purpose to kill his brother in the early chapters. So, from the very beginning, as is obvious from the hint in chapter 7, which foreshadows the major reveal that happens all the way in Shippuden, Itachi was always meant to be an anti-hero and not a villain, which should have been expected, since it played upon the most important themes of the story, those being redemption and what is a shinobi. Danzo not being Hokage after the death of the third is also not a retcon. The elders offers the position to Jiraiya, who rejected it and promised them another Sannin in his place, that being Tsunade. Convincing her to become Hokage was what the ensuing arc was about. It was only after the death of the third that Danzo began to establish himself as an independent political force. Before he was merely the shadow to Hiruzen's fire, and seen as untrustworthy due in large parts to his collaboration with Orochimaru, the killer of the previous Kage. And even upon Tsunade's brief departure from the role, he was still not seen as the best candidate. It's also worth mentioning that Kishimoto had thought of a shadow organization, that is, of what Root became, since at the very least 2002, only 3 years after the manga starts. Its existence is directly mentioned as the first Naruto fanbook, which is authored by Kishimoto himself, where it is called Hidden Leaf Organization. There are scenes of the Leaf meeting with their daimyo that handle the issue directly. Danzo only manages to become a temporary Hokage because of his argument with the daimyo, after Tsunade had supposedly fumbled her duties, which was also part of Danzo's plan. A Hokage must be both among the strongest shinobi in the village and recognized by the people. The Sannin were by far better candidates than Danzo. He wasn't even mentioned as a worthy candidate by the daimyo. He has to argue with him to stand a chance. Again, it's a case of so-called fans and tourists not reading the manga or watching the anime and making stupid, baffling negative allegations about it. As I have mentioned before, there are actual retcons, as in, additions to the story, which break its continuity, in Naruto, but they are, relatively, insignificant. This type of retcon is abundant in works of fiction of similar expansiveness and quality. Even exceptional book series such as A Song of Ice and Fire feature many of them. In fact, it's beyond impressive how few there are, given Naruto was released on a week-to-week basis, with no notable hiatuses during its production. A noteworthy retcon is Minato having sealed only half of Kurama inside Naruto and having unlocked KCM, which doesn't particularly break the story in any way, and doesn't directly contradict the canon, but is somewhat jarring to see. It does make sense that Minato would eventually tame his friendlier half of the Nine Tails, given they both are within the Reaper's belly, and it's said that the user and the target of the jutsu are destined to fight for an eternity in it. Minato had a similar disposition to Naruto. He too was a child of prophecy, who tragically dies too early, and other Jinchuriki had managed to tame their beasts as well. The Biju were planned from the start of the series. They weren't a retcon, as confirmed by Kishimoto. Their gradual introduction into the story was part of Kishimoto's intended vision. However, what was a retcon was their origin, as in, their creation by Hagoromo. Gaara had told Naruto that the beast inside him is the spirit of a devil monk. But Kishimoto does seal the issue with an explanation later on. The monk in question was the first Jinchuriki of the One Tail, and though he was saintly in nature, he was despised and feared by the people of the village, due to the stigma which Jinchuriki are burdened with. and thus, his story was distorted with each generation, and someone like Gaara merely heard a mythologized explanation for the One Tail's identity. We learned the information about the Biju was top secret. It was only informally made public after the start of the 4th Shinobi War. Characters like Shikamaru, who didn't have any intel, say things like, the adults called them Jinchuriki. Even someone like Sakura, who studied under Tsunade, didn't know what Biju and Jinchuriki meant. Thus, the contradiction was fully addressed in Part 2. The last noteworthy retcon I will mention is the increasing strength of the 1st and 2nd Hokages. Yes, they were at first supposed to be weaker than Hiruzen. The explanation given as to why Hiruzen was able to defeat the Riddle Tensei versions is that Orochimaru could not summon them as their full power, which alleviates the issue. That's mostly it for actual retcons in Naruto. They pale in comparison to the retcons of, say, One Piece. In One Piece, retcons are not just incredibly common, most of them are terrible to the story. For instance, Luffy's fruit changing from the rubber fruit to the sun god fruit. Shanks not just being an underdog pirate who climbs the ranks, but the child of the strongest of the immortal gods knights, who serves the demonic and literally alien Antichrist, who's got an evil twin, and whose arm, which he sacrifices to save Luffy from the Sea King, was, in reality, marked with the abyssal sigil all along, and thus, he didn't really sacrifice it to save Luffy, but to avoid Demon's control. Even the deaths of characters, which are preceded by a glorious display of martyrial resolve, and which often provoke intense, emotional reactions from characters, are retconned. How did Pell survive a nuke? I don't know. How did Sol survive being frozen as the Buster Call was destroying the island? I don't know. How did Pagaya survive Enel's lightning? How did Pound survive his apparent beheading by Oven? I guess he just pretended to be dead, and nobody realized he wasn't. How did Bon Clay survive Magellan's poison? I don't know. How did Kinemon survive being pierced in his stomach by Kaido, after having been struck on the head? The actual explanation for this one is so stupid, I'll move on. Why did Killua not know Nen, when his entire family, even his younger sibling, Kaluto, knew it? He, who was supposed to become the head of the Zoldyaks. And how did he know the name of Zeno's Dragon Dive, when he couldn't have possibly seen it before? It's all because Nen itself was a retcon. The answers are not present in the manga. Sasuke vs Deidara is a controversial fight because most people genuinely don't pay attention to the manga. What is alleged is that Sasuke shouldn't have been able to avoid the final explosion because he was out of chakra, and because it is implausible that he could have summoned Manda and controlled it with genjutsu in seconds. Both of these points are not only wrong, they are directly addressed by the story itself, and anyone who pays the slightest attention and has an IQ above room temperature would know why they make no sense. The major characteristic of Deidara is his envy towards the Uchiha, whose art he perceives as superior to his. That's what his character is built around. He is the typical rebellious teenager, and he is obsessed with what he deems artistic. He became a terrorist against his own homeland, out of boredom and a desire for subversion and destruction. He is in part a satire of CIA-backed modern and postmodern artists and their aesthetic and worldviews. He even mentions Superflash directly, one of the rare instances of Kishimoto shattering the fourth wall in Naruto. He is highly narcissistic, and can't accept that his so-called art is not the greatest. He knows the Uchiha are better artists than him, according to his own criteria, but he refuses to bow down to them. Though he was defeated by Itachi and thus forced to join the Akatsuki, he plans to avenge his shattered ego. He practiced and waited for a second chance at proving himself against an Uchiha. Deidara mistook Sasuke falling to his knees as a sign that he had run out of chakra, when in reality he was hurt from the Chidori. He was overconfident in the damage he'd caused and underestimated his opponent. Had Sasuke actually ran out of chakra, Orochimaru would have come out of his seal. Before Deidara unleashed his final ability, Sasuke had explicitly mentioned he had a plan B, which is precisely what he's forced to execute in response to Deidara's greatest explosion. And back when the chapters were coming out, people had predicted Sasuke would use Manda to survive, since it was subtly foreshadowed at the start of the fight, when he summoned the snake to protect himself. And we see that Sasuke went as far as to instruct Suigetsu to follow his plan B if need be. How Sasuke did was summon Manda, which he had enough chakra to do, and glanced at it. The Sharingan's genjutsu had been established as being so powerful it could control the Nine Tails. It's absurd to think Sasuke would have trouble manipulating Manda. In fact, the main reason for the Uchiha massacre was that a Sharingan user could take control over the Kyuubi to destroy the village if they wished. This was the greatest threat posed by the Uchiha. The point of Kabuto's fight against Sasuke and Itachi is his redemption. Not a single villain from Naruto is two-dimensional, and all of them are portrayed as flawed humans deserving of forgiveness. Kabuto is no different. In Boruto, even the Otsutsuki will be redeemed in the end, as Boruto will do what even Naruto could not have done. The Izanami exists precisely for that reason. It is the perfect opposite to the Izanagi. One erases the past by manipulating reality itself, preventing the user from having to face the consequences of the future. The other forces the targets to confront the past and take hold of his destiny. Kabuto essentially spent eternity in purgatory as penitence for his misdeeds, and was allowed freedom only after distilling the good within himself. Though the norm for Naruto's villains is a tragic death occurring right after their redemption, Kabuto is an exception, as is Orochimaru. Orochimaru went through a fully fledged character arc, spanning from his very introduction to its conclusion at the story's end. Despite him being one of the characters who drifted furthest from humanity, he is still a man at his core. He could not hold back his tears as he attacks the third Hokage, his teacher. He is functionally immortal, and it would be nearly impossible to fully destroy him, but he chose to work for the good of humanity, of his own volition. Instead of plotting against the leaf, he atones for his sins by helping it under the guise of both Sasuke and Naruto. The Hashirama cells are important in the last quarter of the manga, for the same reason the Sharingan are. They represent the other half of duality. They are the abundant physical energy of Ashura, which was passed on to the Senju, as the Sharingan represents the spiritual energy of Indra, and was passed on to the Uchiha. The cells cleverly represents the inversion of the Wheel of Fire, the corruption of Hashirama's very ideology made manifest. The Wheel of Fire is distillment. It means to learn from the past and build upon it. It stands for both the celebration of the good of the past, of its positive legacy, and the bright future that awaits ahead of it. Naruto's antagonists use the literal cells of Hashirama, the progenitor of the ideology, the first Hokage, in their plot to erase the past and destroy the world. It's a solid and clear symbol of the twisted ideology of Madara, yet it went over people's heads, as many other things have, unfortunately. Danzo, the only user of the cells not affiliated with Madara directly, wished to engulf the leaf in shadow, and disregarded the Wheel of Fire as well, distilling not the good of the past, but its mistakes, forcing its evil, outdated ideas upon the future, stifling any hope of change. Kunai and Shuriken were used as distractions since the start of the story. They only occasionally struck characters. If you really think Shinobi tools were forgotten in part 2, you didn't pay attention to Naruto at all. This notion is absolutely incorrect. I have listed nearly every fight of the series in a semi-coherent way, and gave them a score, from 1 to 3, based on how tactical each of them is. Just to clarify, the score is relative to Naruto. A score of 1 simply means the fight is less strategic than those that scored a 2. For comparison's sake, most fights from Hunter x Hunter would score a 1. Examples of fights I'd rate with that score are Gon vs Hisoka, Chrollo vs the Zoldycks, Kurapika vs Uvogin, and Netero vs Meruem. A fight such as Gon vs Gentru and Hisoka vs Castro just barely scores a 2. No, having a character or a narrator over-explain every single thing, even irrelevant or redundant thoughts and details, and actions that are actually shown with clarity to the audience, as though they have 85 IQ, doesn't make the fights more tactical. Off the top of my head, Hunter x Hunter would score an average of 1.4. One Piece doesn't have a single fight which I would give a 2, nor do the majority of shonen manga. The average score for the fights of part 1 is 1.75. The average score for the fights of part 2 is 2.1. This complaint is rather funny. if we consider that one of the most popular void criticisms of Naruto is that its second half focuses too much on Naruto and Sasuke, and fails to introduce and develop new characters, and that it doesn't expand much upon the manga's world building. What does the first half of the War arc do? It introduces a multitude of legendary characters from the past, most of which get a fully fledged fight scene, and develops secondary characters that had been introduced in previous arcs, such as Mifune, Hanzo, and Raza, and its fights are highly tactical, which is also something most readers say they enjoy. It's a great part of the manga, there's nothing bad about it. Liking it or disliking it is subjective. Izanami's existence is foreshadowed by Izanagi's. The jutsu are named after a pair of Japanese deities, which are to each other like the yin is to the yang. Back in the day, fans were able to predict it. Itachi had no reason to use it before his fight against Kabuto. He wished to be killed by Sasuke and give him his eyes. This is perhaps one of the stupidest complaints. Yes, the story used to be about ninjas, but it went out the window when a gigantic fox demon appeared in chapter 1 and destroyed an entire village. As with any shonen series in existence, and as with most fantasy stories, Naruto does ramp up its stakes, and with them, the scale of fights and the power of characters, but from start to finish, the series features magic, talking animals, and references to demons and deities of Japanese mythology. I will apply the same criticism to other manga, to demonstrate how dumb it is. Berserk stopped being a low fantasy story about mercenaries and knights, and political conspiracies to become about demons, gods, and witches. Hunter x Hunter stopped being about hunters to become about wizards, alien furry abominations, and Lovecraftian entities. One Piece stopped being about pirates to become about demons, gods, and aliens. Yes, sometimes, certain plot points can escalate too quickly, and aesthetic changes can feel artificial, but that is not the case with Naruto. It remains cohesive until the end, and escalation is as gradual as it should be. This argument is as popular as it is bad. You can always tell this to people who say this. Either didn't even read the manga or watch the anime, or are functionally illiterate. It's like a litmus test for media literacy and intellectual honesty. It's almost like an IQ test as well. A basic refutation of this argument is extremely intuitive and purely logical. You can almost think of it as a simple equation. What did Neji say? That one's fate is decided upon his birth, and that if one starts as a failure, he will forever remain a failure, and shouldn't even try to succeed. Naruto was perceived to be a failure. He beat Neji, who was considered a genius. Now, some may say Neji's argument was correct, but he was mistaken about Naruto. After all, Naruto was later revealed to have reincarnated the soul of Ashura. But that too is foolish once you understand that the major consequence of Ashura's soul choosing him, that were told in the story, is that it came with a curse that fated him to kill the Indra reincarnate. What did Neji say again? That it's impossible to overcome one's fate. And what did Naruto accomplish? Did he, perhaps, overcome his fate by breaking the cycle of hatred, by healing the everlasting grudge between brothers? There are countless other examples of characters defying their fate, of characters changing who they are, and redeeming themselves. That is the main theme of Naruto, and it's realized brilliantly from start to finish. It merely progresses alongside the scale of the story. Going back to Neji, some people fail to understand his fatalistic principles, and thus believe he was not being hypocritical when attacking Hinata, even though the story directly addressed it. To debunk this false notion, while also providing an even clearer explanation as to why he was indeed contradictory, I'll frame it through a very intuitive train of logic. Neji believed one's fate is defined by his birth, and that he could never change it, and that it is futile to resist it. Thus, why he told Naruto he should accept he'd always be a failure, instead of trying to succeed. Neji's fate was to be a subordinate of the main branch, and even die for it on command. If he'd murdered a member of the main branch, he'd have been insubordinate, and as such, would have defied his fate. That's what he came close to doing, when he nearly killed Hinata out of angst. The same is true if he were to voluntarily sacrifice himself for the main branch, like a true martyr, instead of dying on command, which is what he believed he was fated to do, and that's how his arc concludes. He did a 180-degree turn by choosing to die for Hinata. His hatred had turned into love. Another misconception related to the reincarnation plot is that Naruto and Sasuke received immense power because of it, which they didn't earn. That's completely false. The only power boost they received from it came right before the end of the story. Every single feat of theirs, before the last 2% of the manga, is unrelated, and even the powers which they got from the sage were only granted to them because they had matured enough throughout their journeys, and presented solutions to heal the shinobi world, which made Hagoromo willing to bless them with his chakra. This complaint is utterly nonsensical, given Naruto is the shonen manga, which better handles its side characters. Naruto does such an exceptional job as this, that it's honestly baffling to me how people still manage to turn their brains off, and repeat the same, tired non-arguments, such as but Tenten and the Konoha 11, and the borderline moronic ones, such as but Rock Lee was forgotten though. Most of the side characters have their own character arcs, subplots, and backstories. Those of them who do not, still have at least one fully fledged fight scene. Each receives attention proportionally to his position in the story. Before proceeding with the refutation, I'll first explain what it means for a character to be wasted. The logic behind this notion is related to build-ups and payoffs. If a character is built up to play a certain role, but doesn't, he's wasted. That's the clearest way to define the concept. For instance, if a secondary character is said to hold a grudge against another, the story should resolve that lingering thread, either by fulfilling it or subverting it in some way as a rule. Otherwise, one can indeed argue he was wasted. However, nobody would expect a background NPC who doesn't get a single line of dialogue to defeat a major antagonist. The role expected of that non-character was merely to fill panel space. So, to debunk this complaint as it relates to Naruto once and for all, I'll first examine the Konoha 11, and then talk about other noteworthy side characters. Then, I'll compare other shonen manga with Naruto and how they deal with theirs. The Konoha 11, in the most basic sense, serve as a showcase of the village's rookie shinobi population, and they do that very well. Each is beautifully designed, and gets to show their unique abilities in, at the very least, one minor fight. Most of them weren't meant to play a large role in the part 2 of the story, which focuses on broader issues of the shinobi world. All the side characters of the group has their roles fulfilled right after they were introduced. Build-ups involving them were paid off in the same arcs during which they were brought up. Naruto and Sasuke are the protagonists of the story. I'll skip them for obvious reasons. Though it's worth saying, they are by far the best and most complex protagonists in shonen, and it's not even close for reasons already addressed in this video. Sakura undergoes through a great deal of character development throughout the series. She matures both as a person and as shinobi. She remains highly relevant until the end of the story. When the series started, she was merely a mundane little girl. She liked Sasuke, and though she excelled as Kyuri, she was too hesitant to engage in shinobi activities when it mattered. She rectified her mistake by risking her life to protect her comrades from the Sound Ninja, and her slashing her own hair was like a coming-of-age rite. Then, she fought against her childhood rival, and they both shared a flashback. Sakura won by exerting her emboldened resolve. As I've discussed, Sakura embodies unconditional love. As such, she tried bargaining with Sasuke to leave the village with him, which failed. Then, she resorted to begging Naruto for help. It's very satisfying to see her put her hope in Naruto, a boy she used to patronize. Naruto ended up failing to rescue Sasuke, and part 2 begins with him trying to rectify that mistake. But things are more complicated than that, and they are not children anymore by that point of the story. Sakura spends the timeskip training with a legendary Sannin, and early in part 2, we see the payoff to that training in glorious fashion, as she faces Sasori alongside Shioba in one of the greatest fights in the series. The moment of Sakura calling for Naruto's aid in part 1 is replicated in Shippuden, as she screams for Naruto to save the leaf from pain. Once again, she desperately begs for his help, and he attends her call, but this time, he succeeds, and returns to the village as a hero. The love triangle between Team 7 becomes more and more mature as the characters themselves age. It's a wonderfully written, suspenseful part of the series that is incredibly unique in shonen manga. Sakura's arc of deceiving Naruto about her feelings and suppressing her love for Sasuke, as well as the subsequent confrontation with Sasuke, during which she attempts to free Naruto from the burden she imposed upon him, by tragically ending the life of the man she so deeply loves, with her own hands, are a display of Kishimoto's versatility in writing. In Part 1, the characters were children, and acted as such. In Part 2, they were teenagers, and acted as such. There are few great stories, whose characters match the sheer humanity of Naruto's. By the story's end, Sakura became the strongest kunoichi in history. She started as a random girl, born of two irrelevant parents, and ended up at the very top. She gets to fight, at her full power, against Shin in the Gaiden sequel. Shikamaru's flaw is his laziness. Though he performs amazingly in the Chunin exams, so much so that he's the only character to earn the promotion, he doesn't take his role as seriously as he should. He later becomes the leader of the Rescue Sasuke mission, and does his best to ensure they succeed, and risks his life alongside his comrades, proving his worth and maturing as a result. He also gets to play the role of the de facto protagonist of a story arc in Shippuden, in which he undergoes another coming-of-age character arc. He must deal with the loss of his master, which is explored very emotionally and maturely by Kishimoto, and the impact of Azuma's death is felt in Shikamaru's developments. Kakashi also displays development of his own in this arc. He decides to try a different route than the one he's taken with Sasuke in Part 1, upon facing Shikamaru's drive for revenge, choosing to help him instead, to ensure his safety, and that his hatred won't get the best of him. It's a very subtle interaction, which most readers fail to notice. And Shikamaru appears again, in the War arc, in which he displays his prowess as a shinobi, and later loses his father, who also passes his torch to him. Neji was introduced as an antagonist, with a fatalistic ideology that demanded a refutation by Naruto. That build-up was resolved later in the arc, as Naruto defeated him both physically and ideologically. Not only was he defeated, but his loss also resulted in character development, as he freed himself from his own flawed worldview. He went from despising Naruto, from viewing him as a loser fated to die a loser, into volunteering to give his life for him, and nearly doing so in a highly strategic fight, and thanking Naruto for helping him overcome his own shadow, as he fainted. Neji's death as the War arc is the perfect conclusion to his character arc. He went full circle, from hating Hinata and wishing to kill her, to dying for her and for Naruto. Hinata serves both the narrative role of being the first of Naruto's peers to admire him for his qualities, the first to believe in his potential, and, adjacently, of becoming his long-term love interest. Their relationship was built up slowly, and though Naruto was a socially inept fool, and too busy to deal with normal, healthy teenage affairs for most of his journey, he eventually stepped up and understood and reciprocated her feelings. She gets a few moments to shine, though each of them relatively minor. She fights against Neji, and demonstrates her willingness to follow Naruto's words to the bitter end, proving herself a worthy shinobi, despite her limitations. And later, in two separate instances, she sacrifices herself to save Naruto. Rock Lee's dream was to prove he could become an amazing shinobi, despite his crippling limitations. Ironically, by his introduction to the story, he'd already succeeded in doing so by beating Sasuke in a skirmish, but going past that, his performance against Gaara left no doubts as to his qualifications. Though he lost the fight, he displayed impressive skill and resolve, more than was needed for him to prove himself. But unfortunately, just as he did so, he was tragically crippled and told he would never be able to fight again. He has to gamble his life, in a risky surgery should he wish to resume his shinobi career. And that he did, and in the next arc, he came to Naruto's rescue, and yet again showed he was more than capable of holding his own, even if only taijutsu. In conclusion, Rock Lee got two character arcs, one major fight, and two minor fights. Hell that had been built up for his character was resolved subsequently, and satisfyingly so. Kiba was introduced as a bully who underestimated and mocked Naruto for his dream of becoming Hokage, which he deemed foolish, since Naruto was seen as inept. He wasn't evil, nor one-dimensional. He was simply an average kid acting like an average kid. This conflict gets resolved immediately, as Naruto proves to be a worthy opponent, and even defeats him, though partially through a stroke of luck, through a gag, which is fine given the relevance of the fight. Yet, as simple as Kiba's character was, he gets a moment to shine in the final arc of part 1, as he comes to Naruto's aid, risks his life against a dangerous opponent, and nearly dies. As you may have noticed, the Sasuke rescue arc centers around the coming of age of many secondary characters. They go through a symbolic death, and are reborn as proper shinobi, who proves they stake their lives on their duty. Later, Kiba's character goes full circle, as, in the story's end, he is the one mocked for his dream, while Naruto is praised and admired by all, and gets to fulfill his, which once had seemed so far away. Again, Kiba was never evil. What happens is merely a soft, karmic consequence of his past actions, and of his naive, foolish, mild arrogance. Choji also gets his own coming-of-age arc, as he nearly dies to defeat a powerful foe. He faced his childhood insecurities, which were caused by him and his clan being fat, and grew into a man. He quite literally had to become a giant to beat Jirobo, with the butterfly wings of Chakra, alongside his thinner form, representing his development. He proved he was more than what he'd seemed on the surface, that when his help was needed, he could hold his own, and his opponent pays the price for underestimating him. It's a simple, yet effective, relatable, and dignified arc for such a minor, irrelevant character. In part 2, Choji gets a leading role in another fight, and with it, a new character arc. Once again he proves himself. He impresses and surpasses his father Choza. Hino is introduced as a rival to Sakura. She gets a flashback with her, and their conflict is resolved in a fight, in which both display their resolve as shinobi. Ino's strategy is rather interesting too, and so is her ability. In part 2, Hino gets to surpass her father, as she displays unprecedented mastery over her clan's jutsu. She is also generally useful throughout the part, whenever she shows up. And her superficial romantic interest in Sasuke is paid off with Sai. Their relationship is simultaneously intuitive, grounded, and a rather smart gag. Shino is quite unique among all of Naruto's side characters, in the sense that he doesn't have any role to play in the story, yet is part of intricate fight scenes. There was no build-ups to be resolved, no hint of a character arc, yet, abiding to the rule of cool, he gets a few moments to shine, through which Kishimoto deeply explores his bizarre abilities. And finally, there's Tenten, who similarly had no role to play, and there was no hint of a character arc, nor of any plot thread surrounding her. She's the only character among the Konoha 11 to not get a major fight of her own, but her purpose was basically to fill a spot, and that she did very well. Her design is very charming, and so are her abilities, which were brutally countered by Tamari. The only reason people expected more from a character, who was obviously meant to be utterly irrelevant, is that Kishimoto is so talented at creating characters, that even Tenten has her share of fans. Those were the Konoha 11. As I have demonstrated, they were all utilized and developed in excellent proportion to their relevance. And that is the norm for Naruto's characters. They are by far the best of the medium. To briefly expand upon the topic, just as part 1 revolved around the young shinobi of the Leaf, Shippuden focused, for the most part, on the older generation. Hazuma, Gai, and Kakashi held important roles. It also focused on expanding the world, and thus introduced and developed characters from other nations, such as Killer Bee, Hanoki, Hendei, Hanzo, and Chiyoba. It adjacently delved into figures of the past, such as Hashirama, Madara, Tobirama, and other Kage who were summoned as Edo Tensei. There are so many interesting, creative, well-written characters in Naruto, it's frankly absurd. As is the attention it gives each of them, which, again, is perfectly proportional to their importance, as all is perfectly balanced. I can think of so many intriguing secondary characters, which fans still discuss to this day. There is no manga that boasts of a character roster that is better realized than Naruto's. The fact that each character is so tightly written is borderline miraculous given its expansiveness and Kishimoto's work ethic. As is above, so is below. Naruto is a masterpiece. Now for the comparison. In Jujutsu Kaisen, nearly every character is as flat as paper. The vast majority of the cast don't get an arc. You feel nothing when they die, because their deaths are mere drawings, devoid of meaning and catharsis. Yuji only learns to do something other than punch his opponents after the halfway point of the story, and he's the least interesting protagonist I have ever seen in shonen. The scene in which he talks to his grandfather is offensively terrible as an introduction to him. And no, it's quote-unquote intentional mundanity. It's not an excuse for it to lack any substance and read like any bottom-of-the-barrel, unknown manga or even manhwa you can find by accident on a scanlation website. I have never read a worse first chapter in any shonen manga. Yuji's design is also painfully generic, and his pink hair looks stupid. And the premise of his character is just a watered-down version of Naruto's. His dichotomy with Sukuna is also at first a lesser iteration of Naruto's with the Kyuubi. Megumi is infamously useless and barely does anything worth noting throughout the series. He's got zero agency. Even when he's made to kill his sister, the only relevant, personal plot thread involving him in the entire manga, there is zero impact to the writing, and it's as though the characters themselves aren't invested in the situation. He's a joke. The best thing he did was get possessed by Sukuna and leave the story. Nobara is somehow even worse, as she's a glorified NPC with no goal, who gets no development, and even upon being revived, after a fake-out death scene, more than 100 chapters later, she just deals one blow to Sukuna and the story ends. Imagine if Sakura was absent from part 1's ending, all the way to the series' finale, and the only moment she got in part 2 was her punch against Kaguya, which she appeared out of nowhere to do. This is the trio of main characters of Jujutsu Kaisen. The side characters have no subplots, and either don't develop at all, or have developments which feel forced and rushed. It's difficult to even talk about any of them, since they are at best treated like Shino from Naruto, sometimes with an additional backstory, and even then, said backstories are often so bland, or poorly written, that they end up devaluing them more than anything. Jujutsu Kaisen 0 is the perfect microcosmic example of the various writing flaws of the series as a whole. In his own spin-off story, Yuta's tragic backstory is treated like a joke, in such a way that it doesn't feel like it has meaning at all. But while it is portrayed with a cringeworthy, millennial irony and insincerity, a few pages later, after he and Maki were eaten by a father-looking cursed spirit, also a frequent issue with the series, about a third of battles feel meaningless and boring since the enemies are the equivalents to slime enemies from RPGs, killing all tension just from a glance at their designs. We are expected to feel something with Yuta screaming, "I want to believe that it's okay to keep on living." This writing is worse than amateurish, and the very premise that fuels that line, the curse he carries as a burden, is basically only shown to have injured, not even killed, a few NPC bullies who are threatening to kill him for no reason. Yuta's got zero connection to the major antagonist he defeats, Geto, and their first interaction with each other was pitiful. That's the average conflict between hero and villain in Jujutsu Kaisen. How you kill your friends? How you protect my friends? It's even worse in Yuta's case, since he'd just met these people and had barely talked to them. How so? The way Yuta defeats Geto is incredibly contrived. Geto had built an army of more than 4,000 cursed spirits, and yet Yuta can just make a false vow of sacrifice to his stand and overpower him. It's such a terrible Deus Ex Machina, and it's made even worse by the fact that there are zero negative consequences. On the contrary, it's a net positive for Yuta, since Rika's soul is freed, resolving his terribly written subplots, but he gets to keep his super powerful ability. One could make the case that this manga was written and drawn by ChatGPT after being fed half a dozen manhwas and asked to emulate Hunter x Hunter, Bleach, and Naruto. Side characters who don't even get a poorly written subplot like Yuta did, and are utterly flat and boring. Hinumaki, Panda, Mei, Miwa, Kami, Momo, Naobito, and Yuki. Those who do get minor subplots like Mekamaru or Maki are not much better either. And finally, the antagonists are, for the most part, ugly and terribly written too. All are one-dimensional, or laughable attempts at two, or three-dimensional characters. I hate Jogo in particular, whose design is the worst one I have ever seen, for a relevant antagonist in a shonen series. I'm not even joking when I say that Ebisu, who may not even be as the top 50 most relevant characters of Naruto, mugs most of Jujutsu Kaisen's cast to death. I will indulge in a summary of Ebisu's story to prove it. Ebisu is introduced as the teacher of the third Hokage's grandson. a boy whose Embu parents don't give enough attention to, Konohamaru, who, similarly to Naruto, wants to become a great ninja to earn recognition and attention, in his case, from his ever so busy grandfather. Konohamaru becomes infatuated with Naruto, who Ebisu somewhat correctly identifies as a bad influence, and potentially dangerous for being the vessel of Kyuubi, the demon who destroys the village, a little over a decade before. Ebisu takes his role of teacher to the Hokage's grandson rather seriously, and wants to do his best to ensure that his pupil becomes a respectable and competent shinobi. In his first appearance, he seems to be no more than a gag character. Despite him being a strict and formal teacher, Naruto manages to quote-unquote defeat him through the sexy jutsu, breaking his contained demeanor. Naruto is then allowed to play with and teach Konohamaru from time to time. After that mini-arc, the average reader doesn't expect him to show up again in the story. Yet, he does. In the short break before the final tournament of the Chunin exam, Kakashi thought it more prudent to teach Sasuke rather than Naruto, as Sasuke would have to face Gaara, and was almost guaranteed to die or be severely injured without proper training. And because Kakashi was the only one in the leaf who had a Sharingan like Sasuke. As such, he has to entrust Naruto to a different teacher, and he asked Ebisu to teach him. Just as in the first time, Ebisu appears to be there as a gag character. He being chosen as Naruto's teacher subverted everyone's expectations, and despite the disappointment of the reveal, Naruto learns Ebisu has come to respect him as a ninja, and that he no longer views him as just the host of an evil demon. He's one of the first adults in the village to do so, and it's a very sweet moment. Still, Naruto underestimates him alongside the reader. Ebisu challenges Naruto to a game. If he successfully runs away from him, he'll withdraw from his training, but Naruto fails, and Ebisu goes on to instruct him on his poor chakra usage, which, despite coming from such a minor character, is a great piece of advice that Naruto addresses throughout his journey in part 1. This sequence showed Ebisu is a competent and knowledgeable character. He is, of course, soon replaced by Jiraiya, but he's still not done. In Shippuden, Pain, the greatest and most powerful antagonist yet, invades the leaf in search of Naruto. When he's about to find Konohamaru, Ebisu confronts him to buy time for his student, risking his life without a second thought. He is easily subdued, but when demanded to leak Naruto's location to Pain, he can only think of how proud of him he is, and refuses to say anything, even upon being faced with death. Then, Konohamaru ambushes that path of Pain, and defeats it with a Rasengan, Naruto's signature technique, which he'd taught him, fulfilling both his and Ebisu's character arcs. Naruto was, in the end, a good influence for Konohamaru, and their friendship, which Ebisu went on to respect, saved both of their lives. In Naruto, even an absurdly minor, seemingly gag character like Ebisu is treated honorably, and has a tightly written character arc of his own. Then there's Hunter x Hunter, which is a manga that neglects half of its main cast, and fans excuse it by claiming it's an intentional subversion, or deconstruction of shonen tropes. First off, the whole argument surrounding the notion that Hunter x Hunter is uniquely subversive is incredibly flawed to begin with. But even if one concedes that it is subversive in a broader sense, that does not mean it's generally well written, or that the subversiveness is well executed. As will be addressed later in this section, Naruto is actually just as quote-unquote subversive as Hunter x Hunter, only it does its subversion better. As explored before, from the Hunter exam arc all the way to the present day of the story, Kurapika only got a single major fight, and it basically meant nothing to him. Also, the circumstances of his victory were very convenient. He was treated as a Mary Sue, going from a teenager who didn't know anything about Nen, to someone strong enough to defeat one of the original members of the troupe, a man stronger on his own than half of the Nen assassins of the world's most powerful mafia organizations, in 6 months. Imagine if Sasuke had managed to defeat an Akatsuki member in part 1, by himself, after the Chunin exams. Leorio too was essentially abandoned up until the election arc. He still doesn't have a single relevant fight, nor did he have a character arc of his own, or develop in any significant way, other than learning Nen. We barely know what he's been doing behind the scenes, how he learned Nen, and how he has been handling his ambition of becoming a doctor. Though Killua and Gon do show up a lot, after the election arc, Gon was left with no primary goal to pursue, and Killua never had one to begin with, other than helping his friend. Most side characters and even major antagonists in Hunter x Hunter are also strangely underdeveloped. For instance, the Phantom Troop doesn't have a well-defined goal. They just, well, do whatever they want, and that's not particularly captivating most of the time. The only fights many of its members got were against random character-generated ants, with garbage designs and abilities, and those weren't very good. Most of them are also one-dimensional, two-dimensional at best, and have no personal objectives detached from the basic goal of the troop, which is to be bad. Killua's family, the Zoldyaks, have done nothing worth noting throughout the entire series, other than capturing Killua and later letting him go, and Illumi implanting a needle in him. Kite was basically only used as a plot device for a rushed and poorly written interaction with Gon. Gentru was just a generic bad guy with no goal other than getting a money prize. There are some characters that are active detriments to the story, and annoyed me whenever they showed up, especially in the Chimera Ant arc, like Ikalgo and Palm, and basically every ant besides the royal family. Since Gaara puts into question the world building of the series, by being so useless. One positive thing I can say about this topic is that the Succession arc promises to be a step up in most regards, even though its cast is rather bloated, and the vast majority of the side characters featured didn't exist before it began. It's certainly my favorite arc so far. If anything, Naruto's greatest sin against the idiot and the midwit is respecting the reader's intelligence to the degree it does. If people are literate enough to understand the fundamental principles of narrative and character writing, they would be able to perceive Naruto's unparalleled merits. I guess Kishimoto should have included a narrator to pointlessly explain away every single thing that happens on each and every panel, instead of leaving so much to subtext. Naruto uses subversiveness just as much as Hunter x Hunter, only it does it at a consistently higher level of writing. I'll quickly rebuke some arguments fans of Hunter x Hunter make about its deconstructive qualities. For instance, Killua is not a subversion of the shonen co-protagonist, quite the contrary. He is as straight as it gets, which is not a bad thing. For a brief moment in the story, it seemed as though Killua could betray Gon, which would, indeed, be a subversion if explored thoroughly, but he didn't. There was simply a needle in him that would trigger his survival instincts, making him flee even if his friends were in danger, and it was removed in the same arc it was introduced. Killua's nature having been negatively altered due to his treatment by the Zoldyaks could have been a greatly interesting character flaw, but it was conveniently condensed into an object, and resolved with zero need for introspection and character development. For an actual subversion of a shonen co-protagonist, there's Sasuke, whose journey methodically and gradually goes in the opposite way of Naruto's, and he ends up as the final antagonist of the story. Killua, in contrast, is incredibly basic, and develops very little throughout the series. Some people think Hunter x Hunter deconstructs the trope of villain of the week, when it actually uses it a fair bit. When it does somewhat deconstruct it with Meruem, it's an exception to the rule, and not even that well executed as fans claim. A better deconstruction of the trope would be Zabuza from Naruto, who is set up to be the average one-dimensional villain of the week, only for him to grow into a three-dimensional character as the arc progresses. His whole persona was subverted in a twist, and he died as a tragic anti-hero, with the main cast even mourning his death. Other antagonists in Naruto follow his example. Netero sacrificing himself to beat Meruem is also not a subversion, quite the contrary. There are countless examples of the old master sacrificing himself to defeat a villain. That's the default results to expect when an old character or a teacher character is put in such a situation. The only quote-unquote subversive aspect of Netero's death was he activated a bomb, which was rather dishonorable and did not involve Nen. Even though he was the Hokage, Sarutobi used a forbidden, illegal technique which involves the summoning of a demon to trap both his and the villain's souls in an eternal hell once he realized he couldn't win. Gon's anger issues in Chimera Ants are absolutely not a subversion of shonen, and Naruto does the same thing. There are multiple scenes of this exact same trope in Naruto, some of which happened years before the Gon scene in Hunter x Hunter. Gon's body being hurt from the transformation is also exactly what happens to Naruto upon being possessed by the Kyuubi, which after a certain point of the transformation causes his skin to be peeled off. That's why he gets red. It's his flesh and blood, mixing with the Kyuubi's chakra. Exceptional power coming with a cost is a common trope in fiction. What matters is the execution, and Hunter x Hunter dealt with it through a Deus Ex Machina. There is a subversive writing pattern which is very prevalent in Hunter x Hunter, and not in Naruto, the anticlimax. However, anticlimaxes are just as often symptoms of bad writing, as they are an intentional narrative technique, and that's for a good reason. They may simply work against the story and add nothing of value, and Hunter x Hunter's anticlimaxes are a mixed bag. For example, Jing's meeting with Gon was anticlimactic, and it simply wasn't executed as well as it should have been. The ending of the York New arc was also anticlimactic, and for the most part it did not contribute to the story that much. Would it really have been much worse if Hisoka had fought Chrollo there, instead of the two of them basically teleporting to the Heavens Arena, out of nowhere, hundreds of chapters later in the story? Maybe not. For an instance of an anticlimax in another series, was the anticlimactic performance of the Big Mom Pirates in Wano well written just because it was quote-unquote subversive? Was Palpatine's return in the Disney Star Wars trilogy well written just because it was quote-unquote subversive? Of course they were not. To reiterate, and to conclude this topic, subversion and deconstruction aren't indicators of quality, nor of maturity. Those who express such opinions are themselves immature, and by doing so reveal they haven't read many books, and aren't familiar with literature more generally. Naruto had just inherited Hagoromo's chakra, and reached the pinnacle of his powers. He had by this point embodied the Messiah archetype to its fullest extent, and as such, he saved Guy from what had been built up as a scenario of certain death, a miracle worthy of a Christ. It was not a random deus ex machina, but a calculated subversion, and Guy's sacrifice did have lasting consequences. He was still permanently crippled by his actions. We had already seen the capabilities of a fraction of the sage's power in Nagato, and he managed to revive countless people with his chakra, though he used so much of it that he ended up dead as a result. Guy wasn't even dead when Naruto imbued him with his chakra. He was in the process of dying, yes, but Naruto came before his soul left his body. Guy's Shield revival was not like, say, Hisoka's revival. Hisoka, upon simply negating his death via his Nen, not only suffered no consequences, he came back stronger than ever, and even his lost limbs are simply perfectly remade, with a new technique that conveniently makes them actually more resilient and useful than they ever were. This notion is incorrect, and the people who say this can't have properly read the manga, nor watched the anime. Kakashi explicitly states he's losing his sight, and has difficulty aiming his kamui, and he displays fatigue at multiple times. How so? It's explained in the series that the more a character fights, the more he builds up his chakra. Kakashi fought a lot in both parts of the story. It would make no sense for his chakra to remain as low as it was at first. Again, people who say this didn't properly read, nor watch Naruto. Ninshu, a parallel art to ninjutsu, was created to unite people through chakra, chakra being their physical and spiritual energies, their soul and life. Obito had such a powerful bond with Kakashi that their spirits were able to meet, like Naruto and Sasuke, through Ninshu. And in this platonic realm, Obito was able to give his Mangekyo to Kakashi, through a transference of chakra of his very essence. But it was a merely temporary bonus, and when his chakra ran out, Kakashi's eyes vanished. This is a variation of the Neji was right argument, and similarly, it is rooted in basic misunderstandings of the story. I will list the characters who, at least as far as has been shown, have not inherited a particular ability from their genes, yet became legendary, or at least powerful shinobi. This list also excludes Jinchuriki, Minato, Sakura, Hiruzen, Jiraiya, Orochimaru, Kabuto, Shikamaru, Tobirama, Zabuza, Deidara, Sasori, Guy, the White Fang, Kakashi, Kizami, Kakuzu, Konan, most of the other Kage. I could go on. This list is very arbitrary. It avoids most Kekkei Genkai, for instance. But the point is that a character doesn't need to be blessed genetically to climb the ranks. Even among the very talented, some of whom had also powerful Kekkei Genkai, only those who paired a powerful will with excessive training transcended other strong shinobi. Naruto is stated to not have inherited any talent from his parents, and his exceptional chakra is the only advantage he has throughout most of Part 1. However, he still has to learn to use it properly. The Kyuubi was also hindering him in many ways. and in order to properly utilize its powers, he has to earn it. He only managed to fully master them by conquering the Biju in combat and taming its soul, which he could only do after hundreds of chapters of character development. Similarly, Sasuke has to train obsessively from a very young age, transcend his limits multiple times, and increasingly sacrifice himself from his journey start to its end to grow, and his growth was gradual, and felt earned at each step. That includes his mastery of the Sharingan. When the story started, he only had one Tomoe. He only managed to unlock the third Tomoe at the very end of part 1, and the Mangekyo after killing Itachi. The same pattern holds true for his Mangekyo abilities. He has to nearly go blind, and fight multiple strong opponents, risking his life at every moment, to evolve his Susanoo to a middle stage. Sasuke is very unlike, say, a character like Kurapika, who also had blessed genetics, whose power had no significant restrictions, nor demanded any growth from him, being incredibly overpowered from the get-go, and who managed to become a top-tier fighter after a mostly off-screen training arc that lasted a mere 6 months in universe. Killua is incredibly strong from the get-go as well, and both him and Gon are also stated to be 1 in a million talents, as rare as diamonds, which is in proportion rarer than the talents of Naruto's main cast. There are a few reasons why Akatsuki was useful. First off, the Gedo-Mazo statue is incredibly slow at absorbing the Biju. Each Akatsuki member represents one of its fingers, and the presence of each of them as the extraction rituals substantially speeds up the processes. That also implies to be the reason for the importance of the rings each member has. Obito possibly didn't have enough chakra to conduct the ritual by himself. It took 9 Akatsuki members 3 days to finally extract a Biju, and it was the weakest one. The statue might have crumbled if the ritual was conducted without sufficient power, or something similar might have happened. Imagine if Obito was tracked after capturing a Biju, and intercepted during the extraction ritual. He could have died, and the statue might have crumbled. Secondly, Obito was a teenager when he invaded Konoha. The attack was partially conducted out of anger and a desire for retribution. It may be that his failure led him to mature and think about the best way to conduct things from that point on. It's useful to have allies when planning to wage war against the world, and before that raid every great village, to seize their living weapons of mass destruction. Imagine if a younger Obito tried capturing B and something went wrong. It would have severely hampered his plans. And how would he even keep B hostage? Obito also needed Nagato for his Rinnegan, to handle the Gedo statue. Even with Hashirama cells, Obito didn't have enough energy to use the Rinnegan efficiently like Nagato. It would also benefit Obito for him to hide his identity and abilities for as long as he could. The only characters who praise Itachi are Hiruzen, Hashirama, and Sasuke. Sasuke was obviously biased and partially deluded. Hashirama's quote of Itachi being a better shinobi than him makes perfect sense, and Hiruzen saying Itachi has the mentality of a Hokage as a child also makes perfect sense. I will analyze the latter two statements, which as always, people fail to comprehend, to clear up any negative allegations. Itachi was deeply shaped by his experience as a child soldier, and killed a man at 4 years old. He began to see peace, his greater good, as the ultimate and absolute goal of his existence as shinobi. He was willing to die for the village like a Hokage. Thus, Hiruzen's quote is accurate. Hashirama's quote makes sense on 2 fronts. It is in character for him to say such a thing, since one of his main personality traits is his humility. It's even sometimes manifested as a gag. It's also cohesive according to the thematic logic of what means to be a shinobi, and the multiple meanings and answers the series explores. Hashirama's concept of shinobi goes in line with the perception the shinobi world as a whole had of the idea. A shinobi is a perfect tool, an inhuman killing machine that acts strictly for the fulfillment of his duty. Itachi inherited Hashirama's will of fire to a fault, too. Hashirama says to Madara he'd kill his best friend, his brother, even his own child for the sake of the village. What did Itachi do? Put 2 and 2 together, and you'll realize Itachi succeeded Hashirama, flaws and all, and as such made a great deed in his eyes, just like Hashirama killing his soul brother Madara to protect the village. Itachi inherited and improved upon Hashirama's will of fire, though in a dark way. Naruto is the one who manages to surpass or improve upon Hashirama's will of fire in a better way, and he does so by saving and redeeming Sasuke. A shinobi is one who endures, and Itachi endured a lot. Kurama had no intention of killing Naruto to free itself. Its goal was not to roam free, purposeless, in the world, but to tempt Naruto and make him fall into darkness. It saw itself as an incarnation of hatred. The leaf dealt with the Jinchuriki and the Kyuubi with extreme secrecy for multiple reasons. Kushina's pregnancy was hidden to the public. In fact, for all we know, Minato's relationship with Kushina may have been secret to some extent too. Some people will say, but Naruto was a blonde kid and Minato was blonde too. But Minato was never the only yellow-haired man in the village. He was simply one of the first we are shown in the story. Naruto being an amikaze is also not a widely known fact. Even he only knew his Uzumaki roots, and quite superficially as that. He didn't know what exactly has transpired as he was being born. Naruto was an orphan from birth, and throughout his childhood, only his most basic needs were attended, and poorly at that. He had no one who showed even a semblance of love or affection toward him. In fact, he was hated and ostracized by most. He wasn't even allowed to play with other kids. His childhood was denied to him. He was constantly made fun of and underestimated. The people who do not understand this and say stupid things like, Sasuke wasn't even Naruto's best friend, it was Shikamaru, or Naruto was never ostracized, he had friends in his school, have never read the manga, and are informed by the anime's filler at best, and TikTok, or YouTube shorts comments on average. Naruto, who was once despised and ignored, gradually touches the heart and gains the respect of the entire village, character by character, from Ebisu to Tsunade, who becomes the Hokage. That's one of the pillars of the story. I also know that some people, who again, haven't read the manga, and are misinformed about Naruto, will make similarly bogus claims. I'll refute them one by one. Quote, but Naruto was the reincarnation of a god, end quote. I have addressed this false notion in previous refutations already, but what I'll say, additionally, is that Ashura chose Naruto, and at an unclarified point in his life, for his will and disposition, and that Ashura himself was not a god. Hagoromo de facto was, and Ashura was directly stated to not have inherited his father's talent, and to have been a dunce. And I'll repeat, that the only thing this triggered was a curse, which bound Naruto to the fate of killing the Indra reincarnate, his soul brother Sasuke. Quote, but Naruto was incredibly talented. It's a lie that he wasn't. He was a son of a Hokage. End quote. Firstly, it's blatantly stated that he didn't inherit any talent from his parents. Secondly, being an underdog is a matter of context, perception, and portrayal. A character can both be talented and be an underdog simultaneously. For a real-world example that proves it, if an up-and-coming boxer were to fight a world champion, he'd obviously be the underdog, even if he were a 1 in a million talent. Thirdly, Naruto being the son of Minato didn't matter at all until the end of the Pain arc. Barely anyone knew Minato was Naruto's father, and he received no privileges because of it. Quote, but Naruto was saved by the Kyuubi, so he was not an underdog. End quote. The reason why Naruto has the Kyuubi within him to begin with is because it killed both of his parents right after his birth. If both Kushina and Minato had survived, Naruto would have grown to be much more confident, smarter, and disciplined from an early age. He would have access to training by one of the brightest shinobi who'd ever lived, and would have become a prodigy in no time. Kushina too could have taught him Uzumaki sealing techniques, but Naruto was forced to wake up to an empty apartment and eat cup noodles every day of his life as a child. But even disregarding that previous argument, the Kyuubi still did more harm than good at various points. Though its presence increased his overall chakra pool, it disrupted its usage, meaning Naruto would have been able to use his already vast natural reserves more efficiently from the get-go, and be taught jutsu much faster. Though Kyuubi saved or helped him at certain times, its intent was to manipulate him into succumbing to hatred, not just helping him. In the first time it happened, he almost did so, and stopped seeing Haku as human for a brief moment, nearly killing him. Naruto would have killed a pure-hearted kid, his own age. Naruto must continually fight against his hate-filled impulses, while being overcome by the Kyuubi. The point is, precisely, that its interventions are like deals with the devil. Also, People vastly overstates the amount and the influence of its positive interferences. It possessed Naruto and directed his anger at Haku, who would not have killed him anyway, and would have died the exact same way regardless as well. After Naruto has trained to manipulate Kyuubi's chakra, he managed to use a chunk of it against Neji. But for his final and fight-defining strategy, he only used his wit and determination. It allowed him to bully Sasuke as the Valley of the End for a while, but Sasuke would not have killed him had he lost beforehand. Then, it helped Naruto injure Deidara in Part 2, which didn't amount to much, since he escaped. It possessed him while fighting Orochimaru, and in that sequence, it made him hurt Sakura, and caused Naruto's body to be drained, as his skin was peeled off, and his blood was vaporized into its chakra. And finally, it did save Naruto from pain. But it almost snatched his soul as a consequence. Only Minato's intervention saved him and the village. Quote, "But Naruto didn't train as hard as the other characters, and still won some fights." End quote. Naruto was never lazy, he just lacked proper guidance, confidence, and encouragement. We see he actually trained in his home, but he wasn't very smart about it. Once he did find good teachers and father figures, he never stopped training and caught up as best as he could. That's the point. Sasuke sold his soul to the devil, to his devil, to Orochimaru, and as a result, became unimaginably powerful in a short span of time. But Naruto has to deal with and constantly suppress the Kyuubi during his training, and it almost killed his master, Jiraiya, when he was pushed a bit too far. The dichotomy between them was obviously written in a very deliberate way, and masterfully so. And this is the end of this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. It was truly a work of passion. Thanks for watching. If you're interested in supporting my work, and in reading exclusive, profound analysis of movies, literature, music clips, and games, as well as articles about the esoteric, philosophy, and religion written by me, feel free to check out my Patreon. Its members and members of the channel also get access to an exclusive Discord server where they can chat with me directly. Again, thanks for watching, and until the next video.